January the 2nd, 1492, the Alhambra Palace, Granada. Boabdil, the last Islamic ruler in Western Europe, stands in the Court of Lions surrounded by the geometric splendor his ancestors built over 2 centuries. Outside the palace gates, the banners of Castile and Aragon flutter in the winter wind. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, wait to receive what they've pursued for 10 years, the keys to the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. Boabdil is 30 years old. His kingdom, once stretching across the fertile plains of Granada, has been reduced to rubble and starvation by a siege that lasted 9 months. His people are starving. His walls are shattered by Christian artillery. There is no relief coming from North Africa. No miracle will save him. He walks through the palace one final time, past the fountain with its 12 marble lions, past the walls covered in Arabic calligraphy praising Allah, past the chambers where poets once gathered to compose verses that echoed throughout the Islamic world. Then he descends to the gates. The ceremony is brief. Boabdil hands over the keys. Ferdinand accepts them without ceremony. The last Islamic king of Iberia mounts his horse and rides toward the mountains, toward exile in North Africa. According to legend, when he reached the mountain pass and turned for one final look at Granada, he wept. His mother, Isa, reportedly told him, "You do well to weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Whether she actually said this, we'll never know. But the sentiment captures the moment's tragedy. 781 years of Islamic civilization in Iberia, ending not with a glorious last stand, but with quiet surrender and tears. This moment marked the completion of the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of Iberia from Islamic rule. But how did it come to this? How did Iberia, this southwestern corner of Europe, become the stage for one of history's longest civilizational conflicts? How did a land that produced some of humanity's earliest art, that became Rome's wealthiest province, that built one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated Islamic civilizations, transform into the launchpad for a global Spanish empire? To understand January 2nd, 1492, we need to go back, way back, to a time before kings and kingdoms, before Christianity and Islam, before writing or cities or agriculture. We need to go back over 1 million years to when the first humans walked into Iberia and looked up at cave walls they would soon cover with art that still takes our breath away. The story of the Iberians begins in deep prehistory, and it's about to get fascinating. The Iberian Peninsula's human story begins around 1.2 million years ago, when early human ancestors crossed the narrow strait separating Africa from Europe and established themselves in this southwestern corner of the continent. Archaeological evidence from sites like Orte in Granada and Atapuerca in Burgos reveals that human ancestors inhabited these lands almost as early as anywhere else in Europe, making Iberia one of the continent's earliest theaters of human occupation. The Atapuerca Mountains contain what many consider Europe's most significant paleontological treasure. Within the limestone caves of Grandolina, archaeologists have uncovered remains of Homo antecessor, an ancient human species that lived approximately 800,000 years ago, and may represent the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. These early inhabitants crafted simple stone tools using local quartzite and flint, demonstrating an understanding of lithic technology that would evolve dramatically over subsequent millennia. The site of Cima de los Huesos, also within Atapuerca, has yielded the world's largest collection of Middle Pleistocene human fossils, including nearly complete skulls that provide unprecedented insight into human evolution during this critical period. As glacial periods waxed and waned across Europe, Iberia served as a crucial refugium where both human populations and diverse flora and fauna survived harsh climatic conditions that rendered much of northern Europe uninhabitable. During the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets covered vast portions of the continent, the peninsula's relatively temperate climate allowed Cro-Magnon populations to flourish in caves and rock shelters scattered throughout the Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees. Then came the art. The artistic achievements of these Upper Paleolithic peoples reached their zenith in the painted caves of northern Spain. Altamira, discovered in 1879 near Santander, contains some of the finest examples of Paleolithic art in the world. Picture this. The cave ceiling transformed into a natural canvas where ancient artists, working by flickering torchlight approximately 15,000 years ago, created vivid depictions of bison, horses and deer using natural ochre pigments and charcoal. The artists demonstrated remarkable skill in utilizing the cave's natural contours to give their animal subjects three-dimensional form, creating an almost sculptural quality that seems to bring the painted beasts to life in dancing shadows. The techniques were sophisticated, far beyond mere representation. The painters mixed their pigments with animal fat and bone marrow to create durable colors that have survived 15 millennia. They used fingers, primitive brushes made from animal hair, and even blowpipes fashioned from hollow bird bones to achieve different textures and effects. Positioning of paintings within the cave's deepest recesses suggests these weren't mere decorations but held profound spiritual or ritualistic significance for their creators. Similar artistic traditions flourished throughout the Cantabrian region, with painted caves at Tito Bustillo, El Castillo, and Las Monedas, revealing a shared cultural heritage among Upper Paleolithic populations. These weren't isolated artists working alone. This was a civilization with complex symbolic thinking and sophisticated social structures, capable of supporting specialized artistic production over extended periods. But the Ice Age was ending, the climate was warming, and agriculture was coming to Iberia. Everything was about to change. The transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period marked a fundamental transformation in human society across Iberia. Beginning around 7000 BC, agricultural practices began infiltrating the peninsula from the eastern Mediterranean, likely through maritime contacts with early farming communities in the Levant and Anatolia. The fertile alluvial plains of the Guadalquivir, Ebro, and Tagus rivers provided ideal conditions for cultivating emmer wheat, barley, and legumes, while Mediterranean coastal regions proved suitable for early experiments in animal domestication. Archaeological evidence from sites like La Draga near Barcelona reveals that Neolithic communities established permanent settlements along lake shores and riverbanks, constructing substantial wooden structures using sophisticated carpentry techniques. These early farmers developed complex systems of crop rotation and land management that allowed them to support larger, more stable populations than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Pottery production became widespread during this period, with distinctive cardial ceramics, decorated using the serrated edges of cockle shells, appearing throughout the Mediterranean littoral. But the social implications of agricultural adoption extended far beyond mere subsistence strategies. Neolithic communities developed increasingly complex burial practices, constructing elaborate megalithic monuments that required coordinated labor from multiple family groups or clans. The dolmens of Antequera in Andalusia, built around 3500 BC, represent some of Europe's most architecturally sophisticated prehistoric monuments. The dolmen of Menga, measuring over 25 meters in length and constructed from massive stone slabs weighing up to 180 tons, demonstrates the organizational capabilities and engineering knowledge possessed by these early agricultural societies. Think about what this required. Hundreds of people working together, moving stones that weigh as much as modern commercial aircraft, placing them with precision to create chambers that have survived 5,500 years. If this wasn't primitive, this was civilization emerging. Around 2800 BC, something remarkable happened. A distinctive archaeological culture emerged that would profoundly influence the development of Western European civilization, the bell-beaker culture, named for its characteristic inverted bell-shaped pottery vessels. And it originated right here in Iberia before spreading throughout Atlantic and Central Europe. These distinctive ceramic vessels, decorated with intricate geometric patterns applied using cord marking and comb techniques, represent more than mere pottery styles. They indicate the emergence of complex trade networks and shared cultural practices across vast geographical distances. Bell-beaker communities demonstrated remarkable technological innovation, particularly in metallurgy. Archaeological evidence from sites like Zambujal in Portugal and Los Millares in Almeria reveals that these societies developed sophisticated copper working techniques, creating tools, weapons, and ornamental objects that far surpassed anything produced during the preceding Neolithic period. Los Millares itself was extraordinary, a Copper Age settlement fortified with multiple concentric walls and containing over 100 collective burial sites, illustrating the social stratification and territorial organization characteristic of bell-beaker societies. The burial practices associated with bell-beaker culture provide fascinating insights into their social organization. Unlike the collective burials typical of earlier Neolithic communities, bell-beaker societies increasingly practiced individual interment, often accompanied by distinctive grave goods, including their characteristic pottery, copper daggers, stone wrist guards used by archers, and gold ornaments. The appearance of these standardized burial assemblages across such vast geographical areas suggests the existence of shared ideological systems and possibly elite networks that transcended local tribal boundaries. Copper was transforming Iberian society, but an even greater metallurgical revolution was coming. Bronze was about to change everything. Metallurgical innovation accelerated during the early Bronze Age, beginning around 2200 BC. Iberian smiths mastered the complex process of alloying copper with tin to produce bronze, a metal superior to copper in both hardness and durability. But here's the challenge. The sources of tin required for bronze production were geographically limited, necessitating extensive trade networks that connected Iberian communities with distant regions including Cornwall in Britain, Brittany in France, and Central Europe. This wasn't local trade anymore, this was international commerce, spanning the entire European continent. The metallurgical revolution coincided with significant changes in settlement patterns and social organization. The northwest regions of Iberia witnessed the emergence of a distinctive settlement type known as castros, fortified hilltop communities that would dominate the landscape for over a millennium. These settlements, characterized by their circular stone houses and elaborate defensive systems, first appeared during the late Bronze Age and reached their zenith during the subsequent Iron Age. Castro culture developed most extensively in modern-day Galicia, northern Portugal, and Asturias, where hundreds of these fortified sites have been identified. The Castro of Santa Trega in Pontevedra exemplifies the architectural sophistication of these communities. Constructed on a prominent hilltop overlooking the Atlantic coast, the settlement contained over 150 circular stone houses arranged in distinct neighborhoods, each surrounded by multiple defensive walls incorporating complex entrance systems designed to confuse and delay potential attackers. The houses themselves, built using carefully fitted stone blocks without mortar, featured conical thatched roofs and central hearths around which domestic activities centered. Archaeological excavations at Castro sites reveal evidence of specialized craft production, including bronze working, pottery manufacture, and textile production. The discovery of bronze casting molds, crucibles, and slag at sites like Coaña in Asturias demonstrates that these communities supported skilled artisans capable of producing sophisticated metalwork, including weapons, tools, and ornamental objects. Trade networks during the Bronze Age extended far beyond the Iberian Peninsula's boundaries. Archaeological evidence reveals connections with Mediterranean civilizations, Atlantic European communities, and even distant regions of Central and Northern Europe. Amber from the Baltic, ivory from North Africa, and distinctive pottery styles from various European regions have been discovered at Iberian Bronze Age sites, indicating participation in complex exchange systems that moved both raw materials and finished goods across vast distances. But around 1100 BC, another technological revolution arrived that would transform warfare and agriculture even more dramatically than bronze had. The transition to the Iron Age marked a fundamental transformation in Iberian society. Iron tools proved far more efficient than their bronze predecessors for clearing forests, cultivating difficult soils, and constructing increasingly elaborate settlements and fortifications. Regional cultural differentiation became increasingly pronounced during the Iron Age as distinct artistic styles, religious practices, and social organizations developed across different areas of the peninsula. The warrior ideology that would characterize later Iberian societies began emerging during this period, as evidenced by the increasing prominence of weapons in burial assemblages and the appearance of fortified settlements throughout the peninsula. Bronze and iron swords, spears, and shields became symbols of status and identity, while the construction of increasingly elaborate defensive systems suggests a landscape characterized by endemic warfare and territorial competition. But one region of southwestern Iberia was about to emerge as something extraordinary, a kingdom so wealthy that ancient writers would describe it with wonder and disbelief. The Tartessians were coming, and they would build one of Europe's most enigmatic civilizations on mountains of silver. As the Iron Age matured across the Iberian Peninsula, the southwestern regions witnessed the emergence of one of Europe's most enigmatic and wealthy civilizations. Tartessos, a kingdom that would capture the imagination of ancient historians and modern archaeologists alike, rose to prominence around 1100 BC in the fertile valleys between the Guadalquivir and Guadiana rivers. This civilization represented a remarkable synthesis of indigenous Iberian traditions and external Mediterranean influences, creating a unique cultural entity that would dominate southwestern Iberia for over 6 centuries. The wealth of Tartessos stemmed primarily from the region's extraordinary mineral resources. The Sierra Morena Mountains contained vast deposits of silver, copper, lead, and tin, while the nearby Rio Tinto mines yielded copper ores of exceptional purity. Archaeological evidence from mining sites reveals sophisticated extraction techniques that far surpassed contemporary European standards. Tartessian miners constructed elaborate underground galleries supported by timber frameworks, employed hydraulic systems to separate ores from surrounding rock, and developed smelting techniques capable of producing high-grade metals in substantial quantities. But it was silver that became Tartessos's greatest economic asset. Ancient sources describe silver so abundant that Tartessian merchants allegedly crafted anchors, storage vessels, and even feeding troughs from the precious metal. While such accounts likely contain elements of exaggeration, archaeological discoveries confirm that silver production reached industrial scales. Excavations at sites like Cerro Salomon have revealed extensive smelting installations with multiple furnaces, slag heaps containing thousands of tons of waste material, and sophisticated ventilation systems that allowed smiths to achieve the high temperatures necessary for efficient metal extraction. The kingdom's strategic location at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River transformed it into a crucial intermediary between Atlantic and Mediterranean trade networks. Tartessian merchants controlled access to the mineral wealth of the interior while simultaneously managing maritime commerce that extended from the British Isles to North Africa. Their vessels, constructed using advanced shipbuilding techniques that incorporated both indigenous and foreign innovations, navigated the treacherous waters beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. to establish trading relationships with distant Atlantic communities. Tartessian society developed a complex hierarchical structure centered around powerful royal dynasties. Archaeological evidence from elite burial sites reveals a warrior aristocracy that accumulated vast wealth through control of mining operations and trade networks. The tomb goods discovered at sites like La Joya near Huelva include elaborate bronze vessels imported from Central Europe, ivory carvings from North Africa, gold jewelry displaying sophisticated craftsmanship, and iron weapons of exceptional quality. These burial assemblages demonstrate not only the wealth of Tartessian elites, but also their extensive international connections. The material culture of Tartessos blended indigenous Iberian traditions with influences from across the Mediterranean world. Pottery production achieved remarkable sophistication, with artisans creating vessels decorated with geometric patterns, animal motifs, and occasionally human figures. The distinctive Tartessian pottery style incorporated techniques learned from Eastern Mediterranean craftsmen while maintaining decorative elements rooted in local Bronze Age traditions. Religious practices in Tartessos combined indigenous Iberian beliefs with deities and rituals borrowed from various Mediterranean cultures. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals the worship of fertility goddesses, solar deities, and protective spirits associated with mining and metalworking. Votive offerings discovered at these sites include miniature weapons, jewelry, and animal figurines, suggesting complex ritual practices that sought divine protection for commercial ventures and military endeavors. But Tartessos's wealth was about to attract attention from across the Mediterranean. Foreign merchants were coming, sophisticated seafarers with alphabetic writing, advanced technologies, and commercial practices that would transform Iberian civilization forever. The Phoenicians were approaching, and nothing would ever be the same. The arrival of Phoenician merchants around 1100 BC marked a transformative moment in Iberian history. These skilled seafarers from the eastern Mediterranean, modern-day Lebanon and coastal Syria, established trading posts along the southern and eastern coasts, creating permanent settlements that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of indigenous development. The Phoenicians brought with them advanced technologies, sophisticated commercial practices, and most importantly, alphabetic writing systems that would eventually be adapted by indigenous populations. Gardia, modern Cadiz, became the most significant Phoenician foundation in Iberia. Established on a strategic island location that provided excellent harbour facilities and defensive advantages, Gardia evolved into the western terminus of Phoenician trade networks that stretched across the entire Mediterranean basin. The settlement's founders selected the site carefully, recognizing its potential to control maritime access to the mineral wealth of Tartessos while providing a secure base for further Atlantic exploration. The urban planning of Gardia reflected sophisticated Phoenician architectural traditions adapted to local conditions. Archaeological excavations have revealed a carefully organized settlement with distinct residential, commercial, and religious quarters. The harbor installations included substantial stone quays, warehouses for storing trade goods, and shipyards capable of constructing and repairing large merchant vessels. The city's defensive system incorporated both natural advantages and artificial fortifications, creating an almost impregnable stronghold that could withstand prolonged sieges. Phoenician merchants introduced revolutionary commercial practices that transformed indigenous economic systems. They established standardized weights and measures, developed complex credit arrangements that facilitated long-distance trade, and created sophisticated accounting systems that tracked transactions across vast geographical distances. These innovations allowed indigenous communities to participate in Mediterranean-wide trade networks for the first time, dramatically expanding their economic horizons and access to foreign goods. The technological transfers initiated by Phoenician contact proved equally transformative. Phoenician craftsmen introduced advanced metallurgical techniques, that improved the efficiency of silver and copper production, pottery-making methods that enhanced both quality and quantity of ceramic production, and textile production technologies that created new opportunities for specialized manufacturing. These technological improvements enabled indigenous communities to produce goods that met Mediterranean market standards, facilitating their integration into broader commercial networks. Perhaps most significantly, the Phoenicians introduced alphabetic writing to Iberian populations. The Phoenician alphabet, adapted from earlier Semitic writing systems, provided a flexible and efficient method for recording information that far surpassed the limitations of purely oral traditions. Indigenous populations gradually modified Phoenician letters to accommodate the phonetic requirements of their own languages, creating distinctive Iberian scripts that would be used for centuries. These writing systems enabled the recording of legal documents, commercial contracts, religious texts, and administrative records that provided unprecedented insights into indigenous social organization. But the Phoenicians weren't the only Mediterranean civilization interested in Iberia's wealth. Greek colonial ventures beginning around 700 BC introduced another layer of Mediterranean influence to Iberian development. Unlike the Phoenicians, who focused primarily on commercial activities, Greek colonists established permanent agricultural settlements that sought to recreate the social and political institutions of their homeland. These colonies became centers of cultural transmission that introduced Greek artistic styles, religious practices, and political concepts to indigenous populations. Emporion, established by colonists from Phocaea around 575 BC, became the most successful Greek settlement in Iberia. Located on the Catalonian coast near modern Impures, the colony occupied a strategic position that allowed control of trade routes connecting the Greek world with indigenous Iberian communities. The settlement's urban layout followed typical Greek colonial patterns, with a central agora surrounded by public buildings, residential quarters organized along geometric street grids, and defensive walls incorporating the latest military engineering techniques. Mediterranean influence was transforming Iberia. Indigenous peoples were learning to write, adopting new technologies, integrating into international trade networks. But they weren't simply copying foreign models, they were synthesizing these influences with their own traditions, creating something unique. By 500 BC, three major cultural groups had crystallized across the Iberian territories, each developing distinct characteristics that would define them for centuries, and their warrior cultures were about to become legendary throughout the ancient world. The cultural impact of Emporion extended far beyond its immediate vicinity. Greek merchants and craftsmen established trading relationships with indigenous communities throughout northeastern Iberia, introducing Greek pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and artistic motifs that would be adopted and adapted by local populations. Archaeological evidence from indigenous sites reveals the gradual incorporation of Greek decorative elements into local material culture, creating hybrid artistic styles that reflected the complex cultural interactions occurring throughout the region. Greek religious practices also influenced indigenous spiritual traditions. The Greeks introduced anthropomorphic representations of deities, gods and goddesses depicted as humans rather than abstract symbols, temple architecture that created permanent sacred spaces, and ritual practices that differed significantly from indigenous religious traditions. Some native communities adopted Greek deities while maintaining their traditional beliefs, creating syncretic religious systems that combined elements from multiple cultural sources. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals this religious fusion, with Greek-style votive offerings appearing alongside traditional indigenous ritual objects. The establishment of Greek colonies also facilitated the transmission of political concepts that would influence indigenous social development. Greek ideas about citizenship, political participation, and urban organization provided alternative models to traditional tribal structures. While most indigenous communities maintained their traditional political systems, some began experimenting with more centralized forms of government that incorporated elements borrowed from Greek colonial institutions. The development of indigenous writing systems represents one of the most significant cultural achievements of this period. Building upon alphabetic principles learned from Phoenician and Greek contacts, various Iberian populations created distinctive scripts adapted to their specific linguistic requirements. The northeastern Iberian script, used primarily in modern Catalonia and Valencia, employed a combination of alphabetic and syllabic signs that allowed precise representation of Iberian languages' complex phonetic structure. The southwestern script, used throughout Tartessian territories, developed somewhat differently, incorporating more syllabic elements and distinctive letter forms that reflected the region's particular cultural influences. Archaeological discoveries have revealed inscriptions on stone monuments, bronze plaques, pottery vessels, and even lead sheets demonstrating that literacy spread beyond elite circles to include merchants, craftsmen, and possibly even ordinary citizens. These writing systems enabled the recording of legal documents, commercial contracts, religious texts, and administrative records that provided unprecedented insights into indigenous social organization. By 500 BC, three major cultural groups had crystallized across the Iberian territories, each developing unique characteristics while maintaining complex relationships with their neighbors and Mediterranean trading partners. The interior regions of the peninsula witnessed the rise of the Celtiberians, a confederation of tribes whose name reflected their mixed Celtic and indigenous Iberian heritage. These peoples occupied the harsh, mountainous terrain of the central Meseta, where they developed a distinctive warrior culture that would become legendary throughout the ancient world. Celtiberian society centered around fortified hilltop settlements, known as oppida, massive stone constructions that dominated strategic positions throughout the landscape of modern Castile, Aragon, and parts of Leon. The oppidum of Numantia, perched on a commanding hilltop overlooking the Duero River Valley, exemplified Celtiberian urban planning and defensive architecture. The settlement's walls, constructed from precisely fitted stone blocks without mortar, rose to heights of over 6 meters and incorporated sophisticated defensive features, including projecting bastions, complex gate systems, and carefully planned killing fields that channeled attackers into predetermined zones. Within these formidable defenses, the town contained over 2,000 inhabitants living in rectangular stone houses arranged along carefully planned streets. The warrior ethos permeated every aspect of Celtiberian society, shaping social structures, religious practices, and artistic expression. Young men underwent rigorous military training that began in childhood and continued throughout their lives, developing skills in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and the use of the distinctive Celtiberian shield known as the cetra. This small round shield, crafted from wood and leather with bronze reinforcements, required exceptional skill to wield effectively but provided experienced warriors with remarkable mobility and defensive capability. But it was Celtiberian metalwork that would become most famous throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Their swords were legendary, and the process of creating them was extraordinary. Celtiberian metalwork achieved extraordinary levels of sophistication, particularly in the production of weapons that became renowned throughout the Mediterranean world. Their smiths developed unique steelworking techniques that produced blades of exceptional quality, combining high carbon content with sophisticated tempering methods that created weapons both flexible and durable. The process began with careful selection of iron ore from local deposits, which was smelted in furnaces capable of achieving temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius. The creation of a Celtiberian sword involved multiple stages of heating, folding, and hammering that could take several weeks to complete. Smiths alternated layers of high and low carbon steel, creating complex patterns within the metal that not only enhanced the blade's structural integrity, but also produced distinctive wavy patterns that became highly prized decorative elements. The final stages involved careful tempering in water or oil followed by meticulous sharpening and polishing that created edges capable of cutting through armor and rival weapons with devastating effectiveness. Beyond weapons, Celtiberian craftsmen excelled in the production of jewelry and decorative objects that reflected their sophisticated artistic sensibilities. Bronze torques worn around the neck as symbols of status and identity featured intricate, twisted designs and elaborate terminals decorated with animal motifs, geometric patterns, and occasionally human faces. These objects required exceptional skill to create, involving techniques of casting, chasing, and granulation that demonstrated mastery of complex metallurgical processes. Silver jewelry from Celtiberian workshops incorporated influences from Mediterranean artistic traditions while maintaining distinctively indigenous characteristics. Fibulae, the ornate brooches used to fasten clothing, evolved from simple, functional objects into elaborate artistic statements featuring animal forms, mythological creatures, and abstract designs that reflected the wearer's social status and tribal affiliations. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals that wealthy Celtiberian women wore multiple fibulae simultaneously, creating impressive displays of metalwork that proclaimed their family's prosperity and artistic sophistication. Religious practices among the Celtiberians centered around warrior deities and natural forces that reflected their harsh mountain environment. Archaeological excavations at sanctuary sites have revealed evidence of ritual weapon deposits where warriors offered their finest swords, spears, and shields to divine powers in exchange for protection in battle and success in warfare. These deposits, often located in caves or at the sources of rivers, contained hundreds of weapons deliberately broken or bent to prevent their reuse, suggesting complex beliefs about the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds. The western regions of the peninsula were dominated by the Lusitanians, a confederation of tribes whose territories encompassed much of modern Portugal and western Spain. Unlike their Celtiberian neighbors, the Lusitanians developed a predominantly pastoral economy based on cattle herding, sheep raising, and seasonal migrations that took advantage of the region's varied topography and climate. This mobile lifestyle created a society that valued independence, personal freedom, and resistance to external authority, characteristics that would make them legendary fighters against foreign conquest. Lusitanian settlements differed markedly from the massive oppida of the Celtiberians, consisting instead of smaller, more dispersed communities that could be quickly abandoned when circumstances required. These settlements, known as castros, were typically located on hilltops or other defensible positions, but emphasized concealment and mobility over massive fortifications. The circular stone houses within these settlements were constructed using techniques that allowed rapid dismantling and reconstruction, reflecting the semi-nomadic lifestyle of their inhabitants. The pastoral economy of the Lusitanians created social structures that differed significantly from other Iberian peoples. Wealth was measured primarily in livestock rather than land or manufactured goods, leading to the development of complex systems of animal husbandry that maximized productivity while maintaining the mobility essential to Lusitanian culture. Seasonal migrations followed ancient routes that connected winter grazing areas in the lowlands with summer pastures in the mountains, creating a rhythm of movement that shaped every aspect of social organization. Lusitanian warriors developed fighting techniques adapted to their mobile lifestyle and pastoral economy. Rather than the heavily armored infantry tactics favored by Celtiberians, Lusitanian military forces emphasized cavalry and light infantry capable of rapid movement across difficult terrain. Their resistance to foreign influence would become legendary, but it was the eastern and southern coastal regions that would develop the most sophisticated urban centers, creating hybrid cultures that served as bridges between indigenous Iberia and the Mediterranean world. The eastern and southern coastal regions of the peninsula developed very different characteristics under the direct influence of Mediterranean civilizations. The coastal Iberians, as they became known to ancient historians, created sophisticated urban centers that rivaled contemporary Greek and Phoenician cities in their architectural complexity and commercial importance. These settlements combined indigenous Iberian traditions with Mediterranean urban planning concepts, creating distinctive hybrid cultures that served as intermediaries between interior populations and foreign merchants. The Iberian city of Ullastret, located near the modern Costa Brava, exemplified the architectural sophistication achieved by coastal populations. The settlement occupied a strategic hilltop position that provided commanding views over the surrounding territory, while offering protection from both land and sea-based attacks. Massive stone walls, constructed using techniques learned from Greek colonial architects, enclosed an area of over 13 hectares containing residential quarters, craft production areas, religious precincts, and public spaces designed for commercial and administrative activities. Within Ullastret's walls, urban planning reflected sophisticated understanding of both practical and aesthetic considerations. Streets were laid out in roughly geometric patterns that facilitated movement while creating distinct neighborhoods for different social classes and economic activities. The largest houses in coastal Iberian cities featured architectural elements borrowed from Mediterranean traditions but adapted to local conditions and preferences. Central courtyards provided light and ventilation while serving as focal points for family activities, surrounded by rooms dedicated to specific functions, including food preparation, storage, sleeping, and the reception of guests. Decorative elements including painted wall plaster, mosaic floors, and carved stone details demonstrated the wealth and cultural sophistication of their owners. Coastal Iberian agricultural techniques achieved remarkable productivity through the application of intensive cultivation methods learned from Mediterranean contacts. Terraced hillsides maximized the use of available land while preventing soil erosion, supported by sophisticated irrigation systems that channeled water from mountain streams to agricultural plots throughout the coastal plains. These irrigation networks, constructed and maintained through cooperative labor arrangements between different communities, enabled the cultivation of diverse crops including wheat, barley, grapes, olives, and various fruits and vegetables. But it was in sculpture that coastal Iberians achieved their greatest artistic triumphs. The Lady of Elche, discovered near Alicante, represents the pinnacle of Iberian sculptural art. This limestone bust of a woman wearing an elaborate headdress combines indigenous artistic sensibilities with techniques learned from Greek and Phoenician craftsmen, creating a work that is both distinctively Iberian and recognizably Mediterranean in its sophisticated rendering of human features. Iberian sculptors worked primarily in local limestone, creating both freestanding figures and architectural reliefs that decorated public buildings and religious sanctuaries. Their subjects included representations of deities, portraits of elite individuals, warrior figures, and mythological creatures that reflected the complex belief systems developed through cultural contact with Mediterranean civilizations. The technical skill demonstrated in these works, particularly in the rendering of drapery, facial features, and decorative details, indicates the existence of specialized workshops that trained skilled artisans over extended periods. Religious sculptures served particularly important functions in coastal Iberian society, creating focal points for community identity and spiritual practice. Large-scale figures of deities, often combining indigenous and foreign iconographic elements, were installed in prominent locations within urban centers where they served as symbols of divine protection and community prosperity. Trade networks connecting coastal Iberian cities with Mediterranean civilizations achieved unprecedented complexity and geographic scope during this period. Iberian merchants established permanent trading relationships with partners in Greece, southern Italy, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean, creating commercial networks that moved goods, ideas, and people across vast distances. These relationships went beyond simple exchange, involving credit arrangements, joint ventures, and long-term partnerships that required sophisticated commercial practices and legal frameworks. Coastal Iberian merchants developed distinctive pottery styles that became widely recognized throughout Mediterranean markets. Ceramics combined functional design with decorative elements that reflected both indigenous artistic traditions and foreign influences, creating products that appealed to diverse consumer preferences. But this sophisticated world of competing peoples, sophisticated metallurgy, and Mediterranean trade was about to be shattered. Foreign conquerors were coming with military capabilities that far exceeded anything Iberians had ever seen. The Carthaginians were approaching, and they brought with them a general named Hannibal, who would transform Iberia into the staging ground for one of history's most famous wars. The established political landscape of Iberia faced its greatest challenge when Carthaginian forces under Hamilcar Barca landed near Gadir in 237 BC, initiating a period of foreign domination that would fundamentally transform the peninsula. The Carthaginians, seeking compensation for territories lost during the First Punic War against Rome, recognized Iberia's strategic value not merely as a source of wealth, but as a launching point for their renewed conflict with Rome. The silver mines of the Sierra Morena, which had enriched Tartessian kingdoms centuries earlier, now became the foundation for Carthaginian military expansion and the eventual theatre for one of history's most decisive conflicts. Hamilcar Barca's initial campaigns demonstrated the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that Carthaginian forces brought to Iberian warfare. Rather than relying solely on coastal strongholds, the Carthaginians established a network of inland fortifications that controlled key river valleys and mountain passes. The fortress of Carthage, modern Cartagena, became the centerpiece of this strategic system. Built on a naturally defensible peninsula with multiple harbors, the city featured massive stone walls incorporating the latest Mediterranean siege defense techniques, including projecting towers, complex gate systems, and carefully planned fields of fire that could devastate attacking forces. The urban planning of Carthage reflected Carthaginian administrative sophistication and their understanding of colonial management. The city contained distinct quarters for military personnel, civilian administrators, local Iberian allies, and foreign merchants, each with appropriate facilities and defensive capabilities. Extensive warehouse complexes near the harbors stored not only trade goods but also military supplies, including weapons, armor, siege equipment, and provisions necessary to support large armies operating far from their bases. Carthaginian recruitment strategies transformed traditional Iberian military practices while exploiting existing tribal rivalries and warrior traditions. Rather than imposing foreign military structures, Carthaginian commanders adapted their forces to incorporate indigenous fighting techniques and weapons while providing superior equipment and training. Celtiberian warriors, renowned for their exceptional swordsmanship and fierce independence, found service with Carthaginian forces offered opportunities for wealth and glory that exceeded what their traditional societies could provide. The integration of Iberian cavalry units proved particularly valuable to Carthaginian military operations. Lusitanian horsemen, with their intimate knowledge of local terrain and exceptional riding skills, became elite reconnaissance forces capable of conducting deep penetration raids against enemy territories. The economic transformation accompanying Carthaginian occupation exceeded even the changes brought by earlier Phoenician contact. Mining operations expanded dramatically under Carthaginian management, employing thousands of workers in extraction and processing activities that supplied silver for military expenditures throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from mining sites reveals sophisticated techniques including hydraulic systems for ore separation, improved smelting furnaces capable of higher temperatures, and transportation networks that moved raw materials and finished products across vast distances. Agricultural production intensified to support growing military and civilian populations concentrated around Carthaginian strongholds. Traditional Iberian farming techniques were supplemented with methods developed in North Africa, including improved irrigation systems, crop rotation practices, and the cultivation of new plant varieties adapted to Mediterranean conditions. These agricultural improvements enabled the peninsula to support population levels that would have been impossible under traditional subsistence systems. The arrival of Hannibal in 221 BC marked the beginning of the most dramatic phase of Carthaginian expansion in Iberia. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on consolidating coastal territories and establishing tribute relationships with interior tribes, Hannibal pursued aggressive campaigns aimed at complete territorial control. His siege of Saguntum in 219 BC demonstrated both Carthaginian military capabilities and their strategic understanding of Roman vulnerabilities. Saguntum occupied a formidable defensive position on a rocky outcrop that commanded the coastal plains south of the Ebro River. The city's walls, constructed using massive stone blocks fitted without mortar, rose directly from precipitous cliffs that made direct assault extremely difficult. Hannibal's forces employed sophisticated siege techniques, including the construction of assault ramps, the deployment of torsion artillery, and the systematic undermining of wall sections through tunneling operations that required exceptional engineering skills. The 8-month siege revealed the determination and resources that Carthaginian forces could bring to bear against determined resistance. The fall of Saguntum precipitated the Second Punic War and transformed Iberia into the primary theatre for the conflict between Rome and Carthage. Roman forces were coming, and they brought military organization that would change the peninsula forever. Roman forces under Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio landed near Emporion in 218 BC, beginning a military campaign that would continue for nearly 2 decades and fundamentally alter the political landscape of the peninsula. The Romans brought military techniques and organizational systems that differed dramatically from both indigenous Iberian and Carthaginian approaches to warfare. Roman military engineering capabilities became immediately apparent in their construction of fortified camps that provided secure bases for operations in hostile territory. These camps, built according to standardized patterns that could be rapidly implemented by trained legionaries, featured earthwork defenses, wooden palisades, and internal layouts that maximized defensive effectiveness while providing adequate space for troops, equipment, and supplies. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tarraco reveal the sophistication of Roman military architecture and their understanding of logistical requirements for extended campaigns. The Roman manipular system, with its emphasis on disciplined formations and coordinated tactics, initially struggled against the fluid combat styles employed by Iberian warriors. Celtiberian and Lusitanian forces excelled at exploiting terrain advantages, conducting ambush attacks, and avoiding the direct confrontations that favored Roman tactical superiority. Early Roman defeats at battles like Sissa in 218 BC demonstrated the challenges faced by traditional Mediterranean military systems when confronted with indigenous Iberian warfare. Roman adaptation to Iberian conditions required significant modifications to their traditional military practices. Auxiliary units recruited from allied tribes provided essential capabilities, including mounted reconnaissance, specialized infantry techniques, and intimate knowledge of local terrain and weather conditions. These auxiliary forces operated with greater independence than traditional Roman military units, conducting long-range patrols, gathering intelligence, and engaging in the type of irregular warfare that characterized much of the Iberian conflict. The strategic importance of Iberian silver mines became increasingly apparent as both sides recognized that control of these resources would determine their ability to sustain military operations. Roman forces systematically targeted Carthaginian mining operations not merely to deny resources to their enemies, but to secure the wealth necessary for their own expanding military commitments. The capture of mining centers required specialized techniques, including the construction of siege works in mountainous terrain and the development of supply lines capable of supporting operations far from coastal bases. The Battle of Baecula in 208 BC demonstrated the evolution of Roman tactical capabilities under the pressure of Iberian warfare. Scipio Africanus, commanding Roman forces, employed a combination of traditional legionary formations and innovative tactics adapted to local conditions. His use of Iberian auxiliary units to outflank Carthaginian positions while maintaining the disciplined advance of Roman heavy infantry created a tactical synthesis that proved devastatingly effective against enemies who had previously dominated battlefield encounters. Roman victory at Baecula marked the beginning of systematic Carthaginian withdrawal from Iberian territories. But the conflict's conclusion did not bring immediate peace to the peninsula. Indigenous populations, having experienced 2 decades of intensive warfare and foreign occupation, faced the challenge of adapting to Roman administrative systems that differed fundamentally from both their traditional political structures and Carthaginian colonial practices. The Roman approach to territorial administration emphasized the establishment of permanent settlements that could serve as centers of Roman influence while providing security for ongoing military operations. These settlements, initially military colonies populated by veteran legionaries, gradually evolved into urban centers that attracted indigenous populations seeking the economic opportunities and security that Roman administration provided. The transformation of military camps into permanent cities represented a fundamental shift from the temporary occupation strategies employed by earlier Mediterranean civilizations. Roman legal systems introduced concepts of property ownership, commercial regulation, and dispute resolution that conflicted with traditional Iberian customs based on kinship relationships and tribal authority. The gradual implementation of Roman law required careful negotiation with indigenous leaders who retained significant influence over their followers and could either facilitate or obstruct Roman administrative objectives. But complete Roman control over the peninsula would take nearly 2 more centuries of warfare, rebellion, and systematic conquest. The Iberian interior remained unconquered, the mountain peoples remained defiant. And Rome was about to learn that conquering Iberia would require patience, brutality, and the personal intervention of emperors themselves. The final phase of conquest was coming, and it would be led by Augustus Caesar himself. The completion of Augustus's Cantabrian and Asturian campaigns in 19 BC marked the definitive end of indigenous resistance and the beginning of Hispania's transformation into one of Rome's most prosperous and culturally significant provinces. The emperor's personal involvement in these final campaigns demonstrated the strategic importance Rome placed on securing complete control over the peninsula's mineral wealth and establishing secure northern frontiers that would protect the increasingly valuable territories to the south. The initial administrative framework established by Augustus divided Hispania into 3 distinct provinces, each designed to address specific geographic, economic, and strategic considerations. Hispania Citerior, later renamed Tarraconensis after its capital at Tarraco, encompassed the vast northern and eastern territories from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic coast. This enormous province, covering nearly 2/3 of the peninsula, reflected both the recent conquest of northern territories and the need for centralized military command to prevent future rebellions among the recently subdued mountain tribes. Hispania Ulterior was subdivided into 2 more manageable administrative units that recognized the distinct characteristics of the peninsula's southern and western regions. Betica, with its capital at Cordoba, controlled the wealthy Guadalquivir Valley and surrounding territories that had experienced the longest period of Mediterranean influence. The province's boundaries encompassed the former Tartessian heartland, areas that had been thoroughly integrated into Roman commercial networks during the previous 2 centuries of conquest and colonization. Lusitania, centered on the newly founded city of Emerita Augusta, governed the western territories that had been the homeland of the fierce Lusitanian tribes. Each province received a carefully designed administrative structure that balanced Roman efficiency with accommodation of local conditions and traditions. Provincial governors, appointed directly by the emperor or the Senate depending on the province's strategic importance, wielded extensive military and civilian authority, but operated within legal frameworks that protected both Roman citizens and indigenous populations who had received various forms of legal recognition. The gradual extension of Roman citizenship to deserving individuals and communities provided powerful incentives for cooperation while creating local elites with vested interests in Roman success. The urban transformation of Hispania began immediately following the establishment of provincial administration, as Roman engineers and architects implemented ambitious construction projects designed to demonstrate imperial power while providing the infrastructure necessary for effective governance. Tarraco, elevated to the status of provincial capital, received massive investments in public architecture that transformed the modest coastal settlement into a magnificent urban centre worthy of its administrative importance. The construction of Tarraco's provincial forum required the levelling of an entire hillside and the creation of artificial terraces supported by massive retaining walls that rose over 20 metres above the natural ground level. This enormous engineering project, completed over several decades, created a monumental complex that included temples dedicated to the imperial cult, basilicas for legal proceedings, and administrative buildings that housed the provincial government's extensive bureaucracy. The amphitheatre constructed at Tarraco demonstrated the Romans' understanding of public entertainment as a tool for cultural integration and political control. Built into a natural depression overlooking the Mediterranean, the structure could accommodate over 14,000 spectators who gathered to witness gladiatorial contests, wild animal hunts, and public executions that reinforced Roman concepts of justice and social hierarchy. The amphitheatre's sophisticated design included underground chambers for storing animals and equipment, complex drainage systems that prevented flooding during heavy rains, and carefully planned entrances that could handle large crowds without dangerous congestion. Aqueduct construction throughout Hispania represented perhaps the most impressive demonstration of Roman engineering capabilities and their commitment to urban development. The aqueduct system serving Tarraco stretched over 25 kilometers from mountain springs to the city, incorporating bridges that spanned deep valleys, tunnels carved through solid rock, and distribution networks that supplied water to public fountains, private houses, and industrial facilities throughout the urban area. The precision required for these constructions demanded surveying techniques that maintained consistent gradients over vast distances while navigating complex topographic obstacles. But perhaps the most iconic Roman structure in all of Hispania would be built at Segovia, and it would still be standing 2,000 years later, carrying water without a single drop of mortar holding its stones together. The aqueduct serving Segovia, with its iconic two-tiered bridge spanning the valley that separates the old city from surrounding hills, required the transportation and precise placement of granite blocks weighing several tons each. The structure's 167 arches, built without mortar, using only the precise fitting of carefully shaped stones, have survived nearly 2 millennia of weathering and seismic activity, a testament to Roman engineering mastery that continues to inspire awe. Road construction proceeded simultaneously with urban development, creating transportation networks that connected every significant settlement with provincial capitals and ultimately with Rome itself. The Via Augusta, extending from the Pyrenees to Gades, became the peninsula's primary arterial route, facilitating the rapid movement of troops, officials, and commercial goods across the entire length of Hispania's Mediterranean coast. The road's construction required bridging major rivers, cutting through mountain passes, and creating stable foundations across varied terrain that included coastal plains, river valleys, and highland plateaus. Roman road engineering in Hispania demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both construction techniques and maintenance requirements. The typical Roman road consisted of multiple layers, including a foundation of large stones, intermediate layers of smaller stones and gravel, and a surface of carefully fitted paving stones that provided smooth, durable travel surfaces capable of supporting heavy traffic in all weather conditions. Drainage systems prevented water damage, while milestone markers provided distance information and identified the officials responsible for construction and maintenance. The economic transformation accompanying Roman administrative consolidation exceeded even the changes brought by earlier Carthaginian occupation. Mining operations expanded to industrial scales that supplied significant portions of the empire's precious metal requirements. The Sierra Morena silver mines reached unprecedented levels of production under Roman management, employing tens of thousands of workers in extraction and processing operations that operated continuously throughout the year. Roman engineers introduced hydraulic techniques that used water pressure to break apart ore-bearing rock formations, a method called ruina montium that literally meant the ruin of the mountains. These operations created artificial reservoirs and distribution channels that could direct water flows with sufficient force to excavate entire hillsides, transforming vast areas of the landscape while producing silver in quantities that influenced monetary systems throughout the Roman world. The Rio Tinto copper mines, already ancient when the Romans arrived, were expanded and modernized using techniques that increased both the quantity and quality of metal production. Roman engineers constructed extensive underground galleries that followed ore veins deep into the earth, supported by timber frameworks and ventilated by carefully planned shaft systems that provided fresh air to workers operating far below ground level. The scale of these operations required the construction of entire settlements to house workers, administrative personnel, and support services necessary for sustained industrial activity. Lead mining operations in the Cartagena region supplied raw materials for the extensive plumbing systems that served Roman cities throughout Hispania and beyond. Agricultural transformation proceeded through the systematic implementation of intensive cultivation techniques that maximized productivity while creating surplus production for export markets. The latifundia system, employing large numbers of slave laborers on extensive estates owned by wealthy Roman citizens, replaced traditional subsistence farming throughout much of southern and central Hispania. These agricultural enterprises specialized in crops that commanded high prices in Roman markets, including wheat, olive oil, wine, and garum, the fermented fish sauce that became a staple of Roman cuisine throughout the empire. Olive cultivation expanded dramatically under Roman management, transforming hillsides throughout Baetica into terraced groves that produced oil of exceptional quality. Roman agricultural techniques included careful selection of olive varieties adapted to local soil and climate conditions, sophisticated pruning and fertilization methods that maximized fruit production, and processing techniques that created different grades of oil for various uses including cooking, lighting, and religious ceremonies. The standardization of production methods and quality control systems enabled Hispanian olive oil to compete successfully in markets throughout the Mediterranean world. Wine production similarly benefited from Roman agricultural expertise and commercial organization. The introduction of new grape varieties, improved cultivation techniques, and systematic aging processes created wines that became highly prized in Rome and other major urban centers. But Rome didn't just transform Hispania economically and architecturally. Roman Hispania produced something even more remarkable. It produced emperors. Two of Rome's greatest rulers would be born right here in the Iberian Peninsula, and they would prove that provincial origins were no barrier to reaching the very pinnacle of imperial power. The emergence of Hispano-Roman elites represented one of the most significant social developments of the early imperial period. Wealthy indigenous families who had successfully adapted to Roman administrative and commercial systems began accumulating political influence that extended far beyond their provincial origins. These families invested their wealth in education, urban properties, and political connections that enabled their sons to pursue careers in Roman government and military service. The educational system that developed in Hispanian cities attracted students from throughout the Western Mediterranean, creating intellectual centers that contributed significantly to Roman literature, philosophy, and legal scholarship. Rhetoric schools in cities like Cordoba and Tarraco trained young men in the oratorical skills necessary for successful political careers, while libraries and scholarly associations provided environments where intellectual activity could flourish under imperial patronage. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, Trajan, born in the Roman colony of Italica near Hispalis, exemplified the opportunities available to ambitious Hispano-Romans who successfully navigated the complex requirements of imperial service. His military career, beginning with service in Germanic frontier regions, demonstrated the competence and loyalty that enabled provincial elites to achieve positions of responsibility within the imperial administration. His appointment as governor of Upper Germania reflected imperial confidence in his administrative abilities and military judgment. Trajan's elevation to imperial power in 98 AD marked a watershed moment in the relationship between Rome and its provincial territories. For the first time, the empire was ruled by someone born outside Italy, demonstrating that merit and achievement could transcend geographic origins within the Roman system. His reign, characterized by extensive military conquests and ambitious building projects, reflected both his personal capabilities and the wealth that flowed from Hispanian provinces to support imperial ambitions. The architectural projects undertaken during Trajan's reign transformed Rome itself while providing models for urban development throughout the provinces. Trajan's Forum, with its innovative design incorporating markets, administrative buildings, and commemorative monuments, demonstrated architectural concepts that were subsequently adapted for use in provincial cities. The techniques developed for these Roman projects, including the use of concrete construction and sophisticated engineering methods, were transmitted to Hispanian architects and engineers who implemented similar projects in their home territories. Hadrian's succession to imperial power in 117 AD continued the Hispano-Roman influence on imperial policy while demonstrating the cultural sophistication that provincial elites could achieve. Born in Italica like his predecessor, Hadrian received an education that combined traditional Roman learning with Greek philosophical traditions and provincial cultural influences. His intellectual curiosity and artistic sensibilities reflected the cosmopolitan environment that characterized the most successful Hispano-Roman families. Hadrian's travels throughout the empire, including extensive visits to Hispanian provinces, demonstrated imperial commitment to provincial development while providing opportunities for local elites to display their loyalty and competence. The construction projects initiated during these visits, including temples, theaters, and infrastructure improvements, created employment opportunities while demonstrating imperial favor toward communities that had successfully integrated into the Roman system. The cultural synthesis that developed in Hispania during the early imperial period created distinctive regional characteristics that combined Roman institutional frameworks with indigenous traditions and Mediterranean influences. Religious practices evolved to incorporate Roman deities within existing sacred landscapes, creating syncretic belief systems that satisfied both imperial requirements and local spiritual needs. The Latin language gradually replaced indigenous languages throughout most of Hispania, but this linguistic transformation occurred through gradual adoption rather than forced imposition. Bilingual inscriptions from the early imperial period reveal the coexistence of Latin with indigenous languages during transitional phases, while the eventual predominance of Latin reflected its practical advantages for commercial, legal, and administrative activities. rather than systematic suppression of local linguistic traditions. But a new religion was about to arrive in Hispania that would prove far more revolutionary than any previous religious innovation. Christianity was coming, and unlike the syncretic adaptations that had characterized earlier religious changes, this faith demanded exclusive devotion and rejected the polytheistic traditions that had defined Mediterranean spirituality for millennia. The transformation would be gradual, often bloody, and ultimately complete. The religious landscape of Hispania underwent a profound transformation during the early centuries of the Common Era, as a new faith from the eastern Mediterranean gradually penetrated the established Roman provincial society. Christianity's arrival in the peninsula occurred through the same commercial and administrative networks that had facilitated earlier cultural exchanges, but its impact would prove far more revolutionary than any previous religious innovation. The earliest Christian communities in Hispania emerged in the major urban centers along the Mediterranean coast, where Greek and Syrian merchants had established trading networks that maintained regular contact with the eastern provinces where the new religion had first taken root. Archaeological evidence from Tarraco suggests the presence of Christian communities by the mid-2nd century, based on distinctive burial practices and symbolic decorations that differed markedly from traditional Roman funerary customs. These early Christians buried their dead in separate cemeteries located outside city walls, avoiding cremation practices that conflicted with their beliefs about bodily resurrection. The catacombs discovered beneath Tarraco reveal sophisticated underground burial complexes that served both practical and spiritual functions for growing Christian communities. These subterranean galleries, carved directly into soft limestone bedrock, contained hundreds of burial niches arranged in multiple levels that maximized the use of available space while providing appropriate settings for memorial services and religious gatherings. The walls featured painted decorations incorporating Christian symbols, including fish, anchors, and doves, that conveyed religious meanings while avoiding overtly Christian imagery that might attract unwanted attention from Roman authorities. Christian communities in Córdoba developed somewhat differently, reflecting the distinct social and economic characteristics of Baetica's capital city. The presence of wealthy Jewish communities in Córdoba provided a foundation for Christian missionary activity, as the new religion's monotheistic theology and scriptural traditions resonated with populations already familiar with non-polytheistic religious concepts. Archaeological discoveries in the city's ancient quarters have revealed house churches dating to the 3rd century, modest residential buildings that were modified to accommodate religious gatherings while maintaining their domestic appearance to avoid attracting official notice. The house church excavated beneath the modern Cathedral of Córdoba demonstrates the architectural adaptations that early Christian communities made to existing urban structures. The building's central courtyard was enlarged to accommodate larger gatherings, while interior walls were removed to create a single large space suitable for communal worship. A raised platform at one end provided space for religious leaders to address assembled congregations, while adjacent rooms served as storage areas for religious texts, ceremonial objects, and charitable supplies distributed to community members in need. Christian communities throughout Hispania faced periodic persecution from Roman authorities who viewed the new religion's exclusive claims and rejection of traditional, civic, religious obligations as threats to social order and political stability. The persecution initiated by Emperor Decius in 250 AD targeted Christian leadership throughout the empire, demanding that all citizens demonstrate their loyalty by participating in public sacrifices to traditional Roman deities. Many Hispanian Christians complied with these requirements, either through genuine apostasy or pragmatic accommodation, but others chose martyrdom rather than compromise their religious convictions. The martyrdom of Saint Fructuosus, Bishop of Tarraco, along with his deacons Augurius and Eulogius in 259 AD, became a foundational event in Hispanian Christian memory and identity. Roman authorities arrested the three men during the persecution ordered by Emperor Valerian, charging them with refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods and undermining public order through their religious activities. Contemporary accounts describe their trial before the provincial governor, where they maintained their Christian faith despite threats of torture and death. The execution took place in Tarraco's amphitheatre, the same venue where gladiatorial contests and wild animal hunts had entertained Roman audiences for generations. The choice of this location was deliberate, intended to demonstrate the consequences of defying imperial religious policies while providing a public spectacle that would discourage others from following the martyr's example. Instead, the dignified behavior of the three men during their execution impressed many spectators and contributed to growing sympathy for Christian beliefs among the urban population. But the persecutions weren't over. More martyrs would follow, and their stories would inspire generations of Hispanian Christians, transforming scattered urban communities into a religious force that would eventually dominate the peninsula's spiritual life. Saint Eulalia of Emerita became another significant figure in early Hispanian Christian martyrology, representing the particular courage of young women who chose death rather than renounce their faith. According to contemporary accounts, Eulalia was a 12-year-old girl from a wealthy Roman family who publicly denounced the persecution of Christians and declared her own Christian beliefs before the provincial governor. Her youth and social status made her defiance particularly shocking to Roman authorities, who initially attempted to persuade her to recant through appeals to her family's position and her own promising future. When persuasion failed, Roman authorities subjected Eulalia to increasingly severe tortures designed to break her resolve and provide an example to other potential Christian converts. The accounts describe her enduring various torments, including burning, laceration, and exposure, maintaining her Christian testimony throughout these ordeals while reportedly experiencing miraculous interventions that demonstrated divine protection. Her eventual death transformed her into a powerful symbol of Christian resistance and divine favor that inspired subsequent generations of Hispanian believers. Saint Vincent of Zaragoza suffered martyrdom during the same persecution, becoming one of the most widely venerated saints throughout the Western Roman Empire. Vincent served as a deacon under Bishop Valerius of Zaragoza, assisting in the administration of Christian communities throughout the Ebro Valley region. When Roman authorities arrested both men during the systematic persecution of Christian leadership, Vincent's eloquence and theological knowledge made him a particular target for official attempts to demonstrate the intellectual weakness of Christian beliefs. The tortures inflicted upon Vincent, as described in contemporary martyrological accounts, exceeded even the brutal standards typical of Roman persecution. Authorities employed heated metal plates, sharp hooks that tore flesh from bones, and salt rubbed into open wounds to maximize his suffering while providing opportunities for him to renounce his faith and save his life. Vincent's steadfast refusal to compromise his beliefs, combined with reports of miraculous events surrounding his torture and death, created a powerful martyrological narrative that spread throughout Christian communities across the empire. The cult of Saint Vincent developed rapidly following his martyrdom, with churches dedicated to his memory appearing in cities throughout Hispania, Gaul, and North Africa. The establishment of episcopal sees in major Hispanian cities occurred gradually during the 3rd and early 4th centuries as Christian communities grew large enough to require formal ecclesiastical organization and gained sufficient social acceptance to operate openly. The Bishop of Córdoba appears in historical records by 300 AD, indicating the presence of a well-established Christian community capable of supporting full-time religious leadership. Similar episcopal positions were created in Tarraco, Emerita Augusta, Hispalis, and other major urban centers as Christian populations reached critical mass and developed the organizational structures necessary for effective religious administration. The Council of Elvira, convened around 305 AD near Granada, represented the first major ecclesiastical assembly in Hispanian Christian history and demonstrated the growing confidence and organizational sophistication of the peninsula's Christian communities. The council brought together bishops from throughout Hispania to address pressing questions about Christian behavior, church discipline, and the relationship between Christian communities and the broader Roman society in which they existed. The detailed canons produced by this assembly provide invaluable insights into the practical challenges faced by early Christian communities and the solutions developed by their religious leadership. The Council's deliberations addressed numerous issues that reflected the complex social situation of Christians living within Roman society, while maintaining religious beliefs that often conflicted with traditional practices. Questions about marriage between Christians and pagans, participation in public festivals that included religious elements, and the appropriate response to persecution dominated the discussions. The bishops sought to establish clear guidelines that would maintain Christian theological integrity while enabling believers to function effectively within Roman social and economic systems. The canons regarding clerical celibacy adopted at Elvira represented one of the most significant decisions emerging from the council, establishing requirements that would influence Christian practice throughout the Western Church for centuries. The bishops decreed that married men who became bishops, priests, or deacons must abstain from sexual relations with their wives, effectively requiring celibacy from all higher-ranking clergy. But the greatest transformation was still ahead. The entire Roman Empire was about to convert to Christianity. And when it did, Hispania would face a new challenge: barbarian invasions that would shatter Roman authority and create political chaos that would reshape the peninsula's civilization forever. The barbarian invasions that began in 409 AD shattered the Roman administrative system that had governed Hispania for over 4 centuries, creating political chaos that fundamentally altered the peninsula's social, economic, and religious structures. The Vandals, Alans, and Suebi who crossed the Pyrenees represented diverse Germanic peoples whose migration into Roman territory reflected complex pressures including population growth, climate change, and conflicts with other tribal groups in Central and Eastern Europe. Their arrival in Hispania marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the peninsula's civilization. The initial barbarian crossing occurred during a particularly harsh winter when the Rhine River froze solid, allowing large numbers of people to cross from Germanic territories into Gaul. Contemporary accounts describe a massive migration involving not only warriors, but entire populations including women, children, elderly individuals, and livestock. How these migrants faced desperate circumstances that made peaceful settlement preferable to continued wandering, but their arrival in Hispania created immediate conflicts with Roman authorities and established populations who viewed them as invaders and threats to existing social order. The Vandals, led by King Gunderic, initially settled in Baetica, where they established control over the wealthy agricultural territories of the Guadalquivir Valley. Their occupation of this region disrupted the olive oil and wheat production that had sustained Roman commercial networks while providing the economic foundation for their emerging kingdom. Archaeological evidence from villa sites throughout Baetica reveals the destruction and abandonment of Roman agricultural installations, suggesting that Vandal occupation involved significant violence and economic disruption. The Suebi established themselves in the northwestern territories of Galicia, where they encountered populations that had maintained stronger connections to pre-Roman cultural traditions and had been less thoroughly integrated into Roman administrative systems. This region's mountainous terrain and dispersed settlement patterns provided advantages for the Suebi's traditional military tactics while limiting the effectiveness of Roman responses. The gradual Suebic conquest of Galician territories proceeded through a combination of military conquest and negotiated agreements with local leaders who recognized the collapse of Roman authority. The collapse of Roman administrative control proceeded gradually as imperial authorities proved unable to coordinate effective responses to barbarian occupation. The withdrawal of regular military units to defend more strategically important territories left Hispanian cities and rural areas dependent on local militias and private armies that lacked the training, equipment, and organizational capabilities necessary to resist determined barbarian attacks. Many Roman officials abandoned their posts and fled to other provinces, taking with them the administrative expertise and institutional knowledge necessary for effective governance. Urban centers throughout Hispania experienced dramatic population declines as residents fled to more secure rural locations or emigrated to other provinces where Roman authority remained intact. Archaeological evidence from cities like Emerita Augusta and Cordoba reveals the abandonment of public buildings, the deterioration of infrastructure including aqueducts and roads, and the conversion of former commercial and administrative areas into agricultural plots. These changes reflected both the immediate impact of barbarian occupation and the longer-term economic disruptions that accompanied the collapse of Roman commercial networks, but into this chaos came a new group of Germanic invaders who would prove far more successful at establishing lasting political authority. The Visigoths were coming, and unlike the Vandals who would eventually sail to North Africa, or the Suebi who would remain confined to the northwest, the Visigoths would conquer the entire peninsula and create a kingdom that would last over 3 centuries. They would adopt Roman law, convert to Christianity, and build one of early medieval Europe's most sophisticated political entities. The Visigothic settlement in southwestern Gaul during 418 AD, under the terms of a foedus with Rome, marked the beginning of a transformation that would eventually encompass the entire Iberian Peninsula. King Theodoric I established administrative systems that maintained Roman legal traditions while incorporating Germanic concepts of personal loyalty and warrior leadership that reflected the military origins of Visigothic political authority. But in 507 AD, everything changed. The Visigoths were defeated by the Franks at the Battle of Vouillé. King Alaric II was killed, and the survivors retreated across the Pyrenees into Hispania, where they would build a new capital and create a new kingdom that would define Iberian politics for the next 2 centuries. The establishment of Toledo as the Visigothic capital around 550 AD represented a crucial decision that would shape the kingdom's subsequent development and cultural character. The city's location in the geographic center of the peninsula provided strategic advantages for controlling territories that extended from the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar, while its position on the Tagus River facilitated communications and transportation throughout the kingdom. The choice of Toledo also demonstrated Visigothic confidence in their ability to govern Roman urban populations and maintain the complex administrative systems necessary for effective rule over diverse territories and peoples. The urban transformation of Toledo under Visigothic rule created one of early medieval Europe's most impressive capital cities, combining Germanic royal traditions with Roman architectural concepts and Christian religious requirements. The royal palace complex, constructed on the city's highest elevation, dominated the urban landscape while providing appropriate settings for the ceremonial activities that reinforced royal authority and social hierarchy. The Cathedral of Toledo became the ecclesiastical center of Visigothic Christianity and the site of numerous church councils that would define both religious orthodoxy and political authority throughout the kingdom. The development of Visigothic legal systems represented one of the kingdom's most significant achievements and lasting contributions to European civilization. And the Liber Judiciorum, promulgated by King Receswinthe around 654 AD, created a comprehensive legal code that applied equally to both Gothic and Roman populations throughout the kingdom. This revolutionary approach to legal administration eliminated the ethnic distinctions that had characterized earlier barbarian legal systems, creating unified governmental structures that facilitated political integration and social cohesion. The compilation of the Liber Judiciorum required extensive legal scholarship that drew upon Roman jurisprudential traditions, Germanic customary law, and Christian theological principles to create coherent legal frameworks applicable to the complex social conditions existing within the Visigothic kingdom. The code addressed virtually every aspect of social, economic, and political life with unprecedented comprehensiveness and sophistication. Property law, criminal law, family law, commercial law all received systematic treatment that balanced competing interests and cultural traditions. But the Visigoths faced a fundamental problem that would shape their entire history in Hispania. They were Arian Christians. The majority of Visigothic peoples had adopted Arianism during their earlier migrations through the Roman Empire, accepting theological teachings that denied the full divinity of Christ and rejected the Trinitarian doctrines that had become orthodox within Roman Christianity. This religious difference created significant barriers to integration with Hispano-Roman populations who remained committed to Orthodox Catholic beliefs and viewed Arianism as dangerous heresy. King Reshared's conversion to Catholicism in 587 AD marked a watershed moment in Visigothic history that fundamentally altered the kingdom's political dynamics and cultural trajectory. Reshared's decision reflected both personal religious conviction and practical political calculations about the advantages of religious unity within his diverse kingdom. The conversion required careful preparation and extensive consultation with both Gothic nobles and Catholic bishops to ensure that the religious transformation would strengthen rather than destabilize royal authority. The Third Council of Toledo convened in 589 AD to formalize the Visigothic conversion to Catholicism, represented one of the most significant ecclesiastical assemblies in early medieval European history. The council brought together Visigothic nobles, Catholic bishops, and representatives from throughout the kingdom to witness and approve the formal renunciation of Arianism and acceptance of Orthodox Catholic doctrine. The proceedings required careful orchestration to demonstrate both the sincerity of the conversion and the unanimous support of the kingdom's leadership for the religious transformation. The political implications of religious conversion extended far beyond theological considerations to encompass fundamental changes in the relationship between royal authority and ecclesiastical power. Catholic bishops who had previously operated under the suspicious oversight of Arian rulers suddenly found themselves in positions of influence and partnership with royal government. This transformation created opportunities for increased church involvement in political affairs while providing kings with powerful allies who could help legitimize royal authority and maintain social order throughout the kingdom. Cultural achievements during the Visigothic period reflected the creative synthesis of diverse traditions and the patronage provided by both royal and ecclesiastical authorities. Architectural innovations combined Germanic structural concepts with Roman building techniques and Christian liturgical requirements, creating distinctive styles that would influence subsequent European architectural development. The church of San Juan de Baños, built by King Receswinthe around 661 AD, exemplifies the architectural sophistication achieved during the Visigothic period. The building featured horseshoe arches, which would later become characteristic of Islamic architecture in Hispania, demonstrating the experimental nature of Visigothic architectural development. But the kingdom's greatest intellectual achievement would come from a bishop in Seville, whose encyclopedic works would preserve classical knowledge and influence European education for centuries. Isidore of Seville, who served as Archbishop of Seville from 600 to 636 AD, produced encyclopedic works that preserved and transmitted classical knowledge while adapting ancient learning to contemporary Christian needs. His Etymologies, a comprehensive survey of human knowledge organized according to linguistic principles, became one of medieval Europe's most influential educational texts. Isidore's scholarly methodology combined Roman educational traditions with Germanic practical concerns and Christian theological frameworks, creating synthetic approaches to learning that reflected the cultural diversity of Visigothic society. His works addressed topics ranging from theology and philosophy to natural science and practical arts, demonstrating both the breadth of knowledge available in Visigothic libraries and the intellectual ambitions of educated elites who sought to maintain cultural continuity despite political upheavals. The preservation and transmission of classical texts through Isidore's efforts proved crucial for subsequent European intellectual development. The establishment of educational institutions throughout the Visigothic kingdom created networks of learning that served both practical administrative needs and broader cultural objectives. Cathedral schools in major cities provided education for clergy and lay administrators, while monastic schools in rural areas preserved and copied manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political instability. These institutions maintained educational standards that enabled the kingdom to produce the trained personnel necessary for effective government while contributing to broader European intellectual life. But internal political instability increasingly characterized the later Visigothic period as succession disputes, noble rivalries, and regional conflicts weakened royal authority and undermined the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The elective nature of Visigothic kingship, which had originally provided flexibility in choosing capable rulers, became a source of chronic instability as competing factions supported different candidates and used succession crises to advance their own interests. The absence of clear hereditary principles created opportunities for ambitious nobles to challenge royal authority and pursue independent political agendas. Succession crises occurred with increasing frequency during the 7th century as the deaths of kings precipitated conflicts between rival claimants and their aristocratic supporters. These disputes often involved military confrontations that devastated particular regions while consuming resources that might otherwise have been used for defense against external threats. The kingdom's fragmentation into competing factions reduced its ability to coordinate effective responses to emerging challenges while encouraging potential enemies to exploit internal divisions. By the early 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom had become dangerously weak. Regional autonomy had increased as local nobles accumulated independent power bases. The absence of a strong king meant that when crisis came, when foreign invaders appeared on the southern coast, there would be no unified response. The political divisions that had plagued the kingdom for decades would prove fatal. In April 711 AD, Islamic forces landed at Gibraltar, and within 8 years they would control virtually the entire Iberian Peninsula, establishing a civilization that would endure for nearly 8 centuries. The Visigothic kingdom was about to end, and a new chapter in Iberian history, one of the most remarkable cultural flowerings in medieval European history, was about to begin. Islamic Spain was coming, Al-Andalus was being born, but first came the conquest, and it would be faster, more complete, and more devastating than anyone could have imagined. King Roderick, the last Visigothic monarch, received news of the invasion while campaigning against Basque rebels in the northern mountains. The timing of the landing had been carefully calculated to exploit the kingdom's internal divisions and the absence of royal forces from the southern territories. Roderick's hasty march southward with whatever troops he could gather demonstrated the kingdom's inability to coordinate effective defensive measures, as regional nobles either refused to provide military assistance or actively collaborated with the invading forces. The decisive confrontation occurred near the Guadalete River in July 711 AD, where Roderick's hastily assembled army met Tariq ibn Ziyad's forces in a battle that would determine the fate of Visigothic Hispania. The Visigothic army, despite its numerical superiority, suffered from the political divisions that had plagued the kingdom for decades. Several key nobles, including the sons of former King Wititza, who had been deposed by Roderick, either withdrew their forces during the battle or actively switched sides to support the Islamic invaders. The death of King Roderick during the battle eliminated the last symbol of unified Visigothic resistance and triggered the complete collapse of organized opposition throughout the kingdom. The Islamic conquest was about to begin in earnest, and nothing would ever be the same. The Battle of Guadalete unfolded over several days of maneuvering and skirmishing before culminating in a decisive engagement that showcased the tactical advantages possessed by Islamic forces. Tariq's cavalry, composed of experienced Arab horsemen supported by Berber mounted archers, demonstrated superior mobility and coordination compared to Visigothic heavy cavalry that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. The Islamic forces employed feigned retreats and coordinated charges that disrupted Visigothic formations while preventing their opponents from utilizing their traditional advantages in close combat. The death of King Roderick during the battle, reportedly killed while trying to rally his retreating forces, eliminated the last symbol of unified Visigothic resistance. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield site reveals the scale of the Visigothic defeat, with weapon deposits and skeletal remains indicating that entire units were destroyed during the final phases of the engagement. The loss of the royal army, combined with the death of numerous nobles and military commanders, left the kingdom's remaining territories defenseless against continued Islamic expansion. Musa ibn Nusayr, the Arab governor of North Africa who had originally authorized Tariq's expedition, arrived in Hispania during 712 AD with a larger force of approximately 18,000 warriors, including a substantial contingent of Arab cavalry and infantry. Musa's arrival transformed what had begun as a limited raiding expedition into a systematic conquest campaign designed to establish permanent Islamic control over the entire peninsula. The combined forces under Musa and Tariq possessed both the military capabilities and administrative expertise necessary to govern the diverse populations and territories they were rapidly acquiring. The conquest proceeded with remarkable speed as Islamic forces encountered minimal organized resistance from the remaining Visigothic strongholds. Major cities throughout the peninsula either surrendered without fighting or fell after brief sieges that demonstrated the futility of resistance against the well-organized Islamic armies. Toledo, the former Visigothic capital, surrendered in 712 AD after its defenders recognized that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary destruction and civilian casualties. The terms of surrender negotiated at Toledo established precedents that would govern Islamic treatment of conquered populations throughout the peninsula. Christian and Jewish communities received protection for their religious practices, property rights, and traditional legal systems in exchange for payment of tribute taxes and acknowledgement of Islamic political authority. These arrangements, formalized in written agreements known as capitulations, provided stability and continuity that facilitated the transition from Visigothic to Islamic rule while encouraging cooperation from existing administrative and religious elites. The rapid collapse of Visigothic resistance reflected not only the military effectiveness of Islamic forces, but also fundamental weaknesses that had developed within the kingdom during preceding decades. Many Hispano-Roman populations viewed the Islamic conquest as liberation from oppressive Visigothic taxation and religious persecution, while Jewish communities welcomed rulers who promised tolerance and protection after centuries of discrimination under Christian governance. The Islamic emphasis on administrative efficiency and religious tolerance contrasted favorably with the arbitrary rule and sectarian conflicts that had characterized the later Visigothic period. The establishment of Islamic administrative systems began immediately following military conquest as Musa and Tariq recognized the importance of creating stable governmental structures that could effectively manage their newly acquired territories. The peninsula was initially organized as a province of the Umayyad Caliphate based in Damascus, with Córdoba serving as the administrative capital due to its central location and existing infrastructure. The choice of Córdoba also reflected practical considerations about controlling the wealthy agricultural territories of the Guadalquivir Valley while maintaining communications with North Africa. The early Islamic administration in Al-Andalus, as the conquered territories became known, operated through a sophisticated system that balanced Arab political authority with practical accommodation of existing social and economic structures. Arab governors appointed from Damascus exercised supreme political and military authority, but they relied heavily on existing administrative personnel and local knowledge to implement policies and collect taxes. This pragmatic approach enabled the rapid establishment of effective governance while minimizing disruption to economic activities and social relationships. The development of a distinctive Andalusian Islamic culture began during these early decades as Arab and Berber settlers interacted with existing Hispano-Roman and Visigothic populations. The process of cultural synthesis occurred gradually through intermarriage, religious conversion, and shared participation in economic activities that created new social categories and cultural practices. The term Muladi emerged to describe Christians who converted to Islam while retaining many of their traditional cultural practices, while Mozarabs referred to Christians who maintained their religious beliefs while adopting Arabic language and Islamic cultural elements. But the most dramatic transformation was yet to come. An agricultural revolution was about to transform Al-Andalus into one of medieval Europe's most prosperous regions, and a refugee prince fleeing massacre in Damascus was about to establish an independent Islamic kingdom that would rival the greatest powers of the medieval world. The agricultural transformation of Al-Andalus represented one of the most significant achievements of early Islamic rule, and demonstrated the technological innovations that Muslim settlers brought from their eastern Mediterranean and North African homelands. Islamic agricultural experts introduced sophisticated irrigation systems that dramatically increased the productivity of existing farmlands while enabling the cultivation of previously barren areas. These irrigation networks, known as acequias, utilized gravity-fed channels, underground aqueducts, and mechanical devices including water wheels and pumps that maximized the efficient distribution of water resources across the Andalusian landscape. The introduction of new crops revolutionized Andalusian agriculture and created the foundation for unprecedented economic prosperity. Islamic settlers brought rice, sugarcane, cotton, citrus fruits, and numerous vegetables that had been unknown in Visigothic Hispania, while introducing improved varieties of existing crops including wheat, barley, and grapes. These agricultural innovations required extensive knowledge of soil conditions, climate patterns, and cultivation techniques that Islamic farmers had developed through centuries of experience in similar Mediterranean environments. The expansion of agricultural production enabled significant population growth and urbanization throughout Al-Andalus, as increased food supplies could support larger concentrations of people in cities and towns. The integration of agricultural surplus with expanding craft production created complex economic relationships that connected rural and urban areas through networks of trade and exchange. Urban planning in Islamic Al-Andalus incorporated architectural concepts and city design principles that reflected both practical considerations and cultural values derived from Islamic civilization. The typical Andalusian city featured a central mosque surrounded by commercial areas, residential quarters organized according to ethnic and religious affiliations, and defensive walls that provided protection while regulating access to urban resources. These urban designs facilitated both commercial activities and social interactions while maintaining the security and order necessary for continued prosperity. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, begun during the 780s under Abd al-Rahman I, exemplified the architectural innovations that characterized early Andalusian Islamic culture. The mosque's design incorporated elements from various Islamic architectural traditions while adapting to local materials and construction techniques that created distinctive regional characteristics. The building's famous horseshoe arches, constructed using alternating red brick and white stone, created visual effects that were both aesthetically striking and structurally efficient, while the forest of columns supporting the roof created interior spaces that could accommodate thousands of worshippers. The mosque's expansion over successive centuries reflected both the growing Muslim population of Cordoba and the increasing wealth and sophistication of Andalusian Islamic civilization. Each edition incorporated architectural innovations and decorative elements that demonstrated the evolving artistic capabilities of local craftsmen while maintaining overall design coherence that unified the entire structure. The mihrab, the prayer niche added during the 10th century, featured intricate geometric patterns, calligraphic inscriptions, and precious materials that represented the pinnacle of Andalusian decorative arts. But the most dramatic political transformation was about to occur. In 756 AD, a young prince arrived in Al-Andalus, a survivor of one of history's bloodiest massacres, Abd al-Rahman. I had escaped when the Abbasid dynasty slaughtered the Umayyads in Damascus, hunting down every member of the royal family they could find. He had fled across North Africa, pursued by assassins, living as a fugitive for years. Now he stood on the shores of Al-Andalus with nothing but his family name and his determination. Within months, he would establish an independent emirate that would rival the Abbasid Caliphate itself. The establishment of the Umayyad Emirate in 756 AD marked a crucial turning point in Andalusian political development and created the conditions for the flowering of independent Islamic civilization in the peninsula. Abd al-Rahman II's success in creating a stable, independent emirate demonstrated both his personal capabilities and the political opportunities available in Al-Andalus for ambitious leaders who could navigate the complex relationships between different ethnic and religious communities. The consolidation of Umayyad authority required careful management of the diverse populations that comprised Andalusian society, including Arabs who claimed superior status as the original conquerors, Berbers who had provided the majority of the invasion forces but felt excluded from political power, and the various categories of indigenous populations who had adapted differently to Islamic rule. Abd al-Rahman's political success depended on his ability to balance these competing interests while maintaining military capabilities sufficient to defend his territories against both internal rebellions and external threats. The development of a sophisticated administrative system enabled the Umayyad Emirate to govern its diverse territories effectively while extracting the resources necessary to support an increasingly elaborate court culture and military establishment. The cultural achievements of the Umayyad period reflected the creative synthesis of diverse traditions and the patronage provided by rulers who recognized the importance of cultural development for political legitimacy and social cohesion. The court at Cordoba became a center of learning and artistic production that attracted scholars, poets, musicians, and craftsmen from throughout the Islamic world and beyond. But the greatest transformation was still ahead. In 929 AD, an Umayyad ruler would proclaim himself not just emir, but caliph, rival to Baghdad itself. The proclamation of the Caliphate of Cordoba in 929 AD by Abd al-Rahman III represented the political and cultural culmination of Umayyad rule in Al-Andalus, and this declaration of independence from Abbasid authority reflected both the emirate's military and economic strength and its ruler's confidence in his ability to compete with other Islamic powers for political and religious leadership. The assumption of the caliphal title demonstrated Andalusian aspirations to equal status with the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad and the Fatimid caliphs of Cairo, while asserting religious authority over Islamic communities in Al-Andalus and beyond. The construction of Madinat al-Zahra, the magnificent palace city built by Abd al-Rahman III near Córdoba, symbolized the wealth and cultural sophistication achieved by the Umayyad Caliphate while providing an appropriate setting for the elaborate court ceremonies that reinforced caliphal authority. The palace complex, covering over 100 hectares, incorporated the most advanced architectural and engineering techniques available while demonstrating the artistic capabilities of Andalusian craftsmen. The buildings featured intricate stone carving, elaborate geometric patterns, and sophisticated water features that created environments of unprecedented luxury and beauty. The administrative innovations developed during the Caliphal period created governmental systems that effectively managed the Caliphate's extensive territories while maintaining the delicate balance between different ethnic and religious communities that had enabled Andalusian prosperity. The bureaucratic institutions established in Córdoba combined Islamic administrative principles with practical adaptations to local conditions, creating efficient systems for tax collection, military organization, judicial administration, and public works management that served as models for other Islamic states. The translation movement that developed in Al-Andalus during the 9th and 10th centuries facilitated the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge while contributing to intellectual developments that would influence European scholarship for centuries. Islamic scholars in Córdoba, Toledo, and other major centers worked systematically to translate Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, often using Latin or Hebrew intermediate versions that had been preserved in Christian and Jewish libraries. These translation efforts preserved works that might otherwise have been lost, while making classical knowledge available to Islamic scholars who could build upon ancient foundations to develop new insights and discoveries. And the medical schools established in Córdoba and other Andalusian cities achieved international recognition for their advanced teaching methods and clinical practices that combined Greek theoretical knowledge with Islamic medical innovations and practical experience. These institutions trained physicians who served not only Islamic populations, but also Christian and Jewish communities that valued their superior medical knowledge and treatment capabilities. The medical texts produced by Andalusian physicians, including surgical manuals and pharmaceutical guides, were translated into Latin and used throughout medieval Europe. Mathematical and astronomical studies flourished under Umayyad patronage as Islamic scholars built upon Greek, Indian, and Persian mathematical traditions while developing new computational methods and astronomical observations. The astronomical tables compiled by Andalusian mathematicians provided more accurate calculations for religious and navigational purposes, while their mathematical innovations, including improved algebraic techniques and geometric proofs, contributed to intellectual developments throughout the Islamic world. The complex relationships between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Al-Andalus created a unique social environment that facilitated cultural exchange while maintaining distinct religious and ethnic identities. The Islamic principle of dhimma provided legal protection for people of the book who accepted Islamic political authority while maintaining their traditional religious practices. That arrangement enabled Christian and Jewish communities to preserve their cultural traditions while participating in the broader economic and intellectual life of Andalusian society. Christian communities known as Mozarabs developed distinctive cultural practices that combined traditional Christian religious observances with Arabic language use and Islamic cultural elements. Mozarab churches incorporated architectural features derived from Islamic models while maintaining Christian liturgical requirements, creating hybrid architectural styles that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout Andalusian society. Jewish communities experienced unprecedented prosperity and cultural flowering under Islamic rule as the tolerant policies of Umayyad rulers enabled them to pursue commercial, intellectual, and artistic activities that had been restricted under Visigothic Christian governance. Jewish merchants established extensive trade networks that connected Al-Andalus with Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, while Jewish scholars made significant contributions to philosophy, medicine, poetry, and religious studies that influenced both Islamic and Christian intellectual development. The economic prosperity that characterized 10th century Al-Andalus reflected the successful integration of diverse populations and resources within a unified political framework that encouraged productive activities while maintaining social stability. But this golden age wouldn't last. The death of a powerful minister in 1002 would trigger a civil war that would shatter the caliphate into dozens of competing kingdoms. The fitna was coming, and when it ended, Islamic Spain would never be the same. The death of al-Mansur in 1002 AD precipitated a succession crisis that would ultimately destroy the Umayyad Caliphate and fragment Al-Andalus into dozens of competing kingdoms. The fitna, the civil war that erupted following the disputed succession, revealed the underlying tensions that had developed within Andalusian society during 3 centuries of Umayyad rule. Regional governors, military commanders, and local notables who had previously submitted to caliphal authority now pursued independent political agendas, transforming administrative provinces into autonomous kingdoms that would reshape the political landscape of medieval Iberia. The initial phase of the civil war centered around Córdoba itself, where rival claimants to the caliphal throne mobilized different factions within the capital's diverse population. The Berber military units that had served as the backbone of caliphal military power found themselves competing with Slavic palace guards and Arab aristocratic families for control of the government apparatus. Street fighting devastated entire neighborhoods of the capital as different ethnic groups settled old grievances while pursuing immediate political advantages. The magnificent libraries and workshops that had made Córdoba the intellectual center of Western Europe suffered extensive damage as buildings were looted and scholars fled to safer territories. The sack of Madinat al-Zahra in 1010 AD symbolized the complete collapse of centralized Umayyad authority and marked the definitive end of the caliphal system that had governed Al-Andalus for over 2 centuries. Berber forces, frustrated by their exclusion from political power despite their military contributions, systematically destroyed the palace complex that had represented the pinnacle of Andalusian architectural achievement. Contemporary accounts describe the methodical dismantling of marble columns, the removal of precious decorative elements, and the destruction of water features that had taken decades to construct. The abandonment of this magnificent site demonstrated that the political and cultural unity that had sustained Andalusian civilization could no longer be maintained through traditional governmental structures. By 1031 AD, the last Umayyad caliph had been deposed, and Al-Andalus had fragmented into approximately 30 independent kingdoms known as taifas. These successor states varied dramatically in size, population, and resources, ranging from major kingdoms centered on cities like Seville, Granada, and Zaragoza, to minor principalities controlling only a single fortified town and its immediate surroundings. The rulers of these taifas, drawn from diverse backgrounds including Arab aristocrats, Berber military commanders, and Slavic palace officials, faced the challenge of establishing legitimate authority while competing with numerous rivals for territory and resources. The Taifa of Seville emerged as one of the most powerful and culturally significant of these successor states under the Abbasid dynasty, founded by Abu al-Qasim Muhammad ibn Abbad. The kingdom's strategic location in the fertile Guadalquivir Valley provided agricultural wealth that could support both military forces and cultural patronage, while its proximity to the Atlantic coast facilitated trade relationships with North Africa and the broader Islamic world. The Abbasid rulers transformed Seville into a major center of Arabic poetry and learning that attracted scholars and artists from throughout Al-Andalus and beyond. The court culture that developed in Seville during the 11th century represented both the continuation of Umayyad traditions and innovative adaptations to the changed political circumstances of the Taifa period. Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abbad, who ruled from 1069 to 1091 AD, exemplified the sophisticated patron rulers who emerged during this era. His own poetry, composed in classical Arabic forms while incorporating themes and imagery specific to Andalusian experience, demonstrated the high level of cultural achievement that individual Taifa courts could sustain despite their limited territorial extent and constant military pressures. The Taifa of Granada, established by the Zirid dynasty, controlled the mountainous territories of southeastern Al-Andalus that would later become the last Islamic stronghold in the peninsula. The kingdom's capital, strategically located at the confluence of the Genil and Darro rivers beneath the Sierra Nevada mountains, provided natural defensive advantages that enabled the Zirids to maintain their independence despite pressure from both Christian kingdoms and rival Taifas. The agricultural productivity of the Vega, the fertile plains surrounding Granada, supplied the economic foundation necessary to support the kingdom's military and administrative requirements. The Zirid rulers invested heavily in fortification projects that transformed Granada into one of Al-Andalus's most formidable defensive positions. The construction of the Alcazaba, a massive fortress complex dominating the city's highest elevation, required sophisticated engineering techniques that incorporated lessons learned from centuries of Islamic military architecture. But the Taifa kingdoms had a fatal weakness. They were militarily vulnerable to Christian expansion from the north, and some Taifa kings even allied with Christian forces against their Islamic neighbors, prioritizing short-term tactical advantages over long-term strategic survival. And they began paying tribute, pariahs, to Christian kingdoms, weakening themselves while strengthening their enemies. The balance of power was shifting, and in 1085 the greatest prize of all would fall to Christian forces. Toledo was about to be conquered, and the shock would force the Taifa kings to make a desperate decision: invite North African warriors to save them. The Almoravids were coming. The capture of Toledo in 1085 AD by Alfonso VI of Castile marked a watershed moment in Christian-Islamic relations that demonstrated the shifting balance of power between the two religious communities. The city's strategic location in the geographic center of the peninsula, combined with its symbolic importance as the former Visigothic capital, made its conquest a significant psychological victory for Christian forces, while representing a devastating loss for Islamic political authority. The relatively peaceful surrender of the city reflected both the military weakness of the Taifa of Toledo and the pragmatic policies pursued by Alfonso VI toward conquered Islamic populations. The siege of Toledo lasted for several years, as Castilian forces gradually tightened their control over the surrounding countryside while cutting off supply lines that connected the city with other Islamic territories. The systematic nature of this siege demonstrated the improved military capabilities that Christian kingdoms had developed through centuries of frontier warfare, including the ability to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods and the engineering skills necessary for effective siege operations. But Toledo's fall created panic throughout the Taifa kingdoms. If the former Visigothic capital could fall, no Islamic city was safe. The Taifa rulers faced an impossible choice: submit to Christian conquest or invite North African warriors to save them. The Almoravid intervention that began in 1086 AD represented a dramatic transformation in the military and political dynamics of Christian-Islamic conflict in the peninsula. The Almoravids, a Berber religious movement that had conquered much of North and West Africa during the preceding decades, possessed military capabilities and religious motivation that exceeded those available to the fragmented Taifa kingdoms. Their arrival in Al-Andalus at the invitation of Seville's ruler, al-Muqtamid, created new challenges for Christian expansion while temporarily reviving Islamic political authority throughout much of the peninsula. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid emir who led the North African intervention, brought with him military forces that combined traditional Berber tactics with innovations developed during decades of warfare in Saharan and sub-Saharan regions. The Almoravid army included large numbers of camel-mounted warriors whose mobility and endurance exceeded those of Christian cavalry forces, while their infantry formations incorporated disciplined units of spearmen and archers who could maintain cohesion during extended engagements. The religious enthusiasm that motivated Almoravid forces provided psychological advantages that compensated for their unfamiliarity with Iberian geographic and climatic conditions. The Battle of Sagrajas, fought near Badajoz in October 1086 AD, demonstrated the military effectiveness of Almoravid forces while revealing the vulnerabilities that had developed within Christian military systems during decades of campaigning against fragmented Islamic opposition. Alfonso VI's army, which included contingents from throughout his kingdom, along with French knights who had come to participate in what they viewed as crusading warfare, suffered a devastating defeat that eliminated much of Castile's military leadership and left Christian territories vulnerable to Islamic counterattacks. The battle unfolded over a single day of intensive fighting that showcased the tactical innovations employed by Almoravid forces and the limitations of traditional Christian military approaches. The Almoravid use of war drums and other psychological warfare techniques disrupted Christian cavalry charges, while their disciplined infantry formations prevented the individual combat that favored heavily armored Christian knights. The arrival of fresh Almoravid reserves during the afternoon phase of the battle transformed what had been a closely contested engagement into a complete Christian rout that left thousands of casualties on the battlefield. The Almoravid conquest of the Taifa kingdoms proceeded systematically during the years following their military victory at Sagrajas, as Yusuf ibn Tashfin eliminated the political fragmentation that had weakened Islamic resistance to Christian expansion. The deposition of Taifa rulers, many of whom were accused of corruption and religious laxity, consolidated Islamic territories under unified military command while providing resources that could be concentrated against Christian targets. This political unification temporarily reversed the momentum of Christian expansion while demonstrating the continued vitality of Islamic military and religious traditions. But the Almoravids brought something the Taifa rulers hadn't expected: religious austerity. The sophisticated court cultures that had flourished in Seville and Granada, the poetry, the philosophy, the scientific investigation, the Almoravids viewed all of it with suspicion. Libraries were destroyed, philosophers were persecuted, rigid religious orthodoxy was imposed, the cultural flowering of Taifa al-Andalus was being systematically eliminated, and within decades another even more radical North African movement would arrive. The Almohads were coming, and they would prove even more austere, even more militant, even more determined to impose religious purity on Andalusian Islam. But they would also face a Christian coalition more powerful and better organized than anything the Almoravids had encountered. The decisive battle was approaching, and it would determine the fate of Islamic Spain for centuries to come. The Almohad movement that emerged in North Africa during the early 12th century represented an even more radical transformation of Islamic political and religious authority than the earlier Almoravid intervention. The Almohads, whose name derived from their emphasis on the unity of God, developed theological and political doctrines that rejected many of the compromises and accommodations that had characterized earlier Islamic rule in both North Africa and Al-Andalus. Their conquest of Almoravid territories during the 1140s created a unified Islamic empire that extended from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the borders of Egypt. Abd al-Mu'min, the first Almohad caliph, established administrative and military systems that could effectively govern the vast territories under Almohad control while maintaining the religious purity that formed the foundation of the movement's political legitimacy. The Almohad conquest of Al-Andalus, completed by 1173 AD, eliminated the remaining vestiges of Taifa political organization while creating unified Islamic resistance to continued Christian expansion. The new rulers invested heavily in fortification projects that strengthened defensive capabilities throughout Al-Andalus while constructing new military installations that could support large-scale campaigns against Christian territories. The Giralda Tower in Seville, originally constructed as the minaret for the city's main mosque, exemplified the architectural achievements of the Almohad period while serving practical functions as both a religious symbol and a military observation post. The military organization developed by the Almohads incorporated lessons learned from previous conflicts with Christian forces, while adapting traditional North African military practices to Iberian conditions. But in July 1212 AD, everything changed. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa shattered Almohad military power and marked the beginning of the end for Islamic political authority in the Iberian Peninsula. The massive Christian coalition assembled by Alfonso VIII of Castile, supported by forces from Aragon, Navarre, and Leon, along with contingents of French crusaders and military orders, confronted the Almohad Caliph al-Nasir in the rugged terrain of the Sierra Morena Mountains. The battle's outcome would determine whether Islamic forces could maintain their defensive capabilities or whether Christian expansion would accelerate toward the completion of the Reconquista. The Almohad army that marched north from Seville represented the culmination of North African military organization and included veteran Berber infantry units, Andalusian cavalry, and contingents from throughout the Almohad Empire extending to the borders of Egypt. Al-Nasir's forces numbered approximately 30,000 warriors, including the elite Almohad Guard units that had proven decisive in previous campaigns against both Christian and Islamic opponents. The Caliph's decision to seek a decisive battle rather than pursue defensive strategies reflected confidence in Almohad military superiority and the belief that a major victory could reverse the momentum of Christian expansion. The battle commenced at dawn with Almohad forces occupying defensive positions on elevated terrain that provided natural advantages against Christian cavalry charges. The Almohad deployment placed Berber infantry in the center, protected by wooden stakes and supported by archers whose composite bows could penetrate most contemporary armor at effective ranges. Andalusian cavalry units positioned on the flanks were tasked with disrupting Christian formations while avoiding direct confrontation with heavily armored opponents whose superior equipment provided decisive advantages in close combat. The initial Christian assault targeted the Almohad flanks where Castilian and Aragonese cavalry could utilize their superior armor and weapons against lighter Islamic forces. Simultaneously, infantry units from the military orders advanced against the center, accepting heavy casualties to maintain pressure that would prevent Almohad reserves from reinforcing threatened sectors. The decisive moment occurred during the afternoon when Christian forces penetrated the Almohad defensive line and captured the Caliph's tent, causing panic throughout Islamic ranks as rumors spread that al-Nasir had been killed. The collapse of Almohad resistance became complete when their reserve units, seeing the apparent death of their leader, abandoned their positions and fled southward toward the safety of fortified cities. The Christian victory was so complete that organized Almohad resistance in Al-Andalus effectively ended, leaving individual cities and regions to organize their own defenses against continued Christian expansion. The aftermath of Las Navas de Tolosa created opportunities for Christian forces to advance rapidly into territories that had been under Islamic control for over 4 centuries. Within decades, the great cities of Al-Andalus would fall one by one. Córdoba in 1236, Valencia in 1238, Seville in 1248. The systematic conquest was underway, but one Islamic kingdom would survive the onslaught. In the mountains of southeastern Iberia, a new dynasty would establish a kingdom that would endure for another 2.5 centuries, creating some of the most beautiful architecture in the Islamic world, while serving as the last refuge for Andalusian Islamic civilization. The Nasrid Kingdom of Granada was about to begin, and it would last until that winter day in 1492 when Boabdil would hand over the keys to the Alhambra. The systematic conquest of major Andalusian cities proceeded with remarkable speed as Christian forces encountered minimal organized resistance from populations demoralized by the Almohad collapse. Córdoba, the former capital of the Umayyad Caliphate and symbol of Islamic political authority in the peninsula, surrendered to Ferdinand III of Castile in June 1236 AD after a siege that lasted only 5 months. The city's fall eliminated the last pretense of unified Islamic resistance, while providing Christian forces with a strategic base for operations against remaining Islamic territories in the Guadalquivir Valley. Valencia's conquest in 1238 AD by James I of Aragon demonstrated the military capabilities that the Crown of Aragon had developed through its expansion along the Mediterranean coast. The siege of Valencia lasted for over a year as Aragonese forces systematically reduced the city's defensive capabilities while preventing relief expeditions from reaching the besieged population. James I's use of naval blockades combined with land-based siege operations created comprehensive isolation that made continued resistance impossible despite the city's formidable fortifications and determined defenders. Seville's surrender in November 1248 AD to Ferdinand III marked the culmination of Castilian expansion into the heart of Al-Andalus and eliminated the last major Islamic stronghold capable of coordinating resistance against Christian forces. The siege of Seville required unprecedented logistical efforts as Castilian forces maintained their positions for over 15 months while constructing siege works that gradually reduced the city's defensive capabilities. The capture of Seville's port through coordinated land and naval operations prevented supplies from reaching the defenders while demonstrating Christian mastery of combined arms warfare. The systematic nature of Christian expansion during the decades following Las Navas de Tolosa reflected improved military organization and strategic planning that enabled sustained campaigns across vast territories. Christian kingdoms developed logistical capabilities that could support large armies operating far from their bases while maintaining siege operations that might continue for months or years. The construction of supply depots, the organization of transport systems, and the coordination of naval and land forces demonstrated military sophistication that exceeded anything achieved during earlier phases of the Reconquista. The consolidation of Christian authority in conquered territories required administrative innovations that could effectively govern diverse populations while extracting resources necessary for continued military operations. The repartimiento system, which distributed conquered lands among Christian settlers, military orders, and royal administrators, created new social structures that integrated territorial conquest with demographic colonization. These land grants provided incentives for Christian settlement while establishing loyal populations that could defend newly acquired territories against Islamic counterattacks. The survival of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada after 1248 AD reflected both the strategic advantages provided by the kingdom's mountainous terrain and the pragmatic policies pursued by its rulers toward their Christian neighbors. Muhammad ibn Nasr, who established the dynasty in 1238 AD, recognized that outright resistance to Christian expansion was impossible given the military balance that had emerged following the Almohad collapse. Instead, he pursued policies of accommodation that acknowledged Castilian suzerainty while maintaining internal autonomy and Islamic religious identity. The tributary relationship established between Granada and Castile provided both kingdoms with advantages that encouraged the preservation of this arrangement for over 2 centuries. Granada's annual tribute payments supplied Castile with substantial revenues that could support military operations in other regions while eliminating the costs associated with conquest and occupation of difficult mountain territories. For Granada, the tribute system provided security against Christian conquest while enabling the kingdom to maintain its distinctive Islamic civilization and serve as a refuge for Muslims fleeing from Christian-controlled territories. The Alhambra Palace complex, constructed during the 13th and 14th centuries, represented the architectural and artistic culmination of Islamic civilization in the peninsula, while symbolizing Granada's unique position as the last independent Islamic kingdom. The palace's sophisticated design integrated residential, administrative, borders and ceremonial functions within a unified architectural program that demonstrated the continued vitality of Islamic artistic traditions. The intricate geometric decorations, innovative water features, and carefully planned spatial relationships created environments of extraordinary beauty that rivaled the greatest achievements of Islamic architecture throughout the medieval world. The Court of Lions, completed during the reign of Muhammad Daif in the late 14th century, exemplified the architectural innovations that characterized the final phase of Islamic rule in the peninsula. The courtyard's central fountain, supported by 12 marble lions and surrounded by an arcade of slender columns, created spatial effects that combined functionality with aesthetic beauty. The mathematical precision required for the courtyard's proportional relationships and the technical skill necessary for carving the decorative elements demonstrated the high level of craftsmanship that Granada's rulers could command despite their kingdom's limited territorial extent. But Granada's survival depended on a delicate balance of tribute payments, diplomatic maneuvering, and the rugged mountain terrain that made conquest costly. By the 15th century, that balance was becoming increasingly precarious. Christian kingdoms were growing stronger, Granada was becoming weaker, and the marriage of 2 monarchs was about to create a united Christian Spain with the resources to finish what had begun nearly 8 centuries earlier. The economic foundation of the Nasrid kingdom rested upon the agricultural productivity of the Vega of Granada and the commercial relationships that connected the kingdom with both Christian territories and North African Islamic states. The intensive cultivation methods developed in the fertile plains surrounding Granada produced agricultural surpluses that could support the kingdom's urban population while providing exports that generated revenue for tribute payments and military expenditures. The preservation and improvement of Islamic irrigation systems enabled sustained agricultural productivity that exceeded levels achieved in many Christian territories. Commercial relationships with Christian kingdoms provided Granada with access to European markets, while supplying luxury goods and raw materials that were not available within the kingdom's limited territories. Granadan merchants established trading networks that extended throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, utilizing their knowledge of both Islamic and Christian commercial practices to serve as intermediaries between different cultural and economic systems. These commercial activities generated revenues that supported the kingdom's administrative and military requirements while maintaining living standards that attracted continued immigration from Christian territories. The cultural achievements of Nasrid Granada represented both the preservation of traditional Islamic learning and the development of new intellectual traditions adapted to the kingdom's unique circumstances. The scholarly institutions established in Granada attracted students and teachers from throughout the Islamic world, while maintaining libraries and scriptoria that preserved classical texts and produced new works of literature, philosophy, and science. Ibn al-Khatib, the great Granadan polymath who served as vizier during the 14th century, exemplified the intellectual sophistication that characterized the final phase of Islamic rule in the peninsula. His historical works, literary compositions, and scientific investigations demonstrated the continued vitality of Islamic scholarship while addressing the practical challenges faced by a small Islamic kingdom surrounded by expanding Christian territories. The gradual weakening of Granada's defensive capabilities during the 15th century reflected both internal political divisions and the growing military superiority of united Castilian and Aragonese forces. Following the marriage of Isabella of Elche of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon in 1469 AD, the dynastic union of the two largest Christian kingdoms created unprecedented resources for military campaigns, while eliminating the political divisions that had previously enabled Granada to play Christian rivals against each other. The consolidation of Christian political authority throughout the peninsula except for Granada made the kingdom's continued independence increasingly difficult to maintain. Internal conflicts within the Nasrid dynasty during the late 15th century provided the Catholic monarchs with opportunities to intervene in Granadan affairs while weakening the kingdom's ability to coordinate effective resistance. The civil war between different claimants to the Nasrid throne divided the kingdom's military resources while creating factions that sought Christian support for their political ambitions. These internal divisions eliminated the political unity that had enabled Granada to survive for over 2 centuries while providing Christian forces with allies who possessed intimate knowledge of the kingdom's defensive capabilities and strategic weaknesses. The final war against Granada began in 1482 AD with Christian attacks on frontier fortresses that gradually reduced the kingdom's territorial extent, while demonstrating the overwhelming military superiority that the Catholic monarchs could bring to bear against Islamic resistance. The systematic nature of Christian operations, which included the construction of permanent fortifications to secure conquered territories and the use of artillery to reduce Islamic strongholds, revealed military capabilities that far exceeded anything available to Granadan defenders. The siege of Malaga in 1487 AD demonstrated the ruthless efficiency with which Christian forces pursued the final conquest of Islamic territories. The siege lasted for over 3 months as Christian artillery systematically destroyed the city's defensive walls, while naval blockades prevented supplies from reaching the defenders. The city's eventual surrender occurred only after its population had been reduced to starvation, while the harsh terms imposed by the Catholic monarchs, including the enslavement of much of Malaga's population, served as a warning to other Islamic cities about the consequences of prolonged resistance. The final siege of Granada began in April 1491 AD with the construction of a massive Christian camp that surrounded the city while preventing any possibility of relief or resupply. The Catholic monarchs' decision to maintain their entire court at the siege site, even constructing a temporary city called Santa Fe with permanent buildings and sophisticated infrastructure, demonstrated their commitment to completing the conquest regardless of the time and resources required. The surrender negotiations that concluded the siege reflected both the hopelessness of Granada's military situation and the pragmatic policies that the Catholic monarchs initially pursued toward the conquered Islamic population. The capitulation agreement signed in November 1491 AD guaranteed religious freedom, property rights, and legal autonomy for Granada's Muslim population, while acknowledging Christian political sovereignty. These terms, similar to those negotiated during earlier Christian conquests, were intended to facilitate the transition to Christian rule while maintaining social stability and economic productivity. But those promises wouldn't last. Within a decade, forced conversions would begin. Within a century, the last Muslims would be expelled. But on January 2nd, 1492, as Boabdil rode away from the Alhambra, none of that had happened yet. That day marked simply the end, the completion of the Reconquista, the end of nearly 8 centuries of Islamic political authority in Iberia. The transformation was complete, The formal surrender of Granada occurred on January 2, 1492 AD, when Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler, handed over the keys to the Alhambra to representatives of the Catholic monarchs. The ceremony, conducted with elaborate protocol that emphasized both Christian victory and Islamic dignity, marked the end of nearly 8 centuries of Islamic political authority in the Iberian Peninsula. The completion of the Reconquista represented not only a military achievement, but also the culmination of a cultural and religious transformation that had reshaped the peninsula's civilization. For Boabdil, the moment was both personal tragedy and political necessity. He was 30 years old, educated, cultured, a poet like so many Granadan nobles before him. But he was also pragmatic enough to recognize that continued resistance would only result in the complete destruction of his city and the slaughter of his people. The terms he had negotiated guaranteed his subjects religious freedom, property rights, and legal autonomy. He believed he was saving them. History would prove him tragically wrong. The aftermath of Granada's conquest revealed the complex challenges involved in integrating the last Islamic territory into the expanding Spanish monarchy. The large Muslim population that remained in Granada posed unprecedented administrative and religious challenges for Christian authorities who had previously dealt with much smaller Mudejar communities. The initial policies of tolerance and accommodation, enshrined in the capitulation agreement, gradually gave way to more aggressive assimilation measures that reflected both religious concerns and practical considerations about maintaining political control over potentially rebellious populations. The year 1492 AD thus marked not only the completion of the Reconquista, but also the beginning of a new phase in Iberian history that would see the peninsula's transformation into the center of a global empire. The resources freed by the end of frontier warfare, combined with the administrative experience gained through centuries of territorial conquest and population management, provided the foundation for Spanish expansion into the Atlantic world. The same year that witnessed the fall of Granada also saw Columbus's first voyage to the Americas, a voyage financed partly with wealth confiscated from Granada, symbolizing the redirection of Iberian energies from internal conquest to global exploration and colonization. So the completion of the Reconquista represented the final triumph of Christian political authority over the Islamic civilization that had dominated much of the peninsula since the 8th century. The transformation of Al-Andalus from a sophisticated Islamic society into Christian Spanish territories marked the end of one of medieval Europe's most remarkable cultural syntheses, while creating the political unity that would enable Spain's emergence as a global power. But the legacy of Islamic presence in Iberia would survive, preserved in architectural monuments that still stand today, in agricultural techniques that transform the landscape, in linguistic influences that enriched the Spanish language, in scientific knowledge that had been preserved and transmitted through Andalusian scholars, and in cultural practices that had become so deeply embedded in Iberian society that they persisted long after the last Islamic kingdom had fallen. The Alhambra still stands, a testament to the sophistication of Andalusian Islamic civilization. The Mezquita of Córdoba, converted into a cathedral but preserving its forest of horseshoe arches, reminds visitors of the architectural genius of the Umayyad Caliphate. The irrigation systems that made the Valencian huerta so productive were Islamic innovations. The words alcalde, azúcar, aceite, algodón, maya, sugar, oil, cotton, all Arabic in origin, all testimony to what Al-Andalus had contributed to Iberian civilization. The Iberians had witnessed over 1 million years of human history, from Homo antecessor painting caves at Altamira to Roman emperors born in Italica, from Visigothic scholars preserving classical knowledge to Islamic poets composing verses in Córdoba's gardens, from Celtiberian smiths forging legendary swords to Catholic monarchs launching global empires. And, through it all, the peninsula had absorbed wave after wave of invaders: Phoenicians, Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Visigoths, Arabs, Berbers, transforming them all, synthesizing them all, creating something uniquely Iberian from each successive layer of conquest and cultural exchange. On January the 2nd, 1492, as Boabdil rode away from the Alhambra toward the mountain pass where he would turn for one last look at Granada, he wept for what was ending, but he couldn't have imagined what was beginning. The Iberian Peninsula, this crossroads of civilizations, this laboratory of cultural synthesis, this stage for some of history's greatest dramas, was about to project its power across the entire globe. The age of Spanish and Portuguese empires was dawning. But that's another story. This one, the story of the Iberians, ends here, on a winter morning in Granada, with the last Islamic king handing over the keys to paradise and riding into exile. While behind him, the Alhambra's fountains continued playing, indifferent to the changing of kingdoms, eternalism as the mountains themselves. So the transformation from medieval to early modern Iberia involved not only political conquest but fundamental changes in religious identity, cultural practices, economic relationships and social structures that would influence Iberian development for centuries. The religious divisions introduced by the Reconquista created lasting separations within Iberian society while generating conflicts that would persist long after the completion of territorial conquest. The systematic conversion campaigns that followed Granada's fall, initially voluntary but increasingly coercive, transformed the peninsula's religious landscape while creating new social categories including conversos, converts from Judaism, and moriscos, converts from Islam, whose loyalty to Christianity remained suspect in the eyes of old Christian populations. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 but reaching its greatest intensity following the conquest of Granada, sought to enforce religious orthodoxy while investigating the sincerity of conversions and punishing those suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish or Islamic religious practices. The Inquisition's activities created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that affected all levels of society while providing mechanisms for settling personal vendettas and seizing property under the guise of religious prosecution. The expulsion of Jews who refused conversion in 1492 eliminated one of Iberia's most economically and culturally productive communities, while demonstrating the Catholic monarch's determination to create religious uniformity within their territories. The expulsion of Moriscos, which occurred in stages during the 16th and early 17th centuries, culminating in the final expulsion of 1609-1614, eliminated the last substantial Muslim population from the peninsula while disrupting agricultural production in regions like Valencia, where Morisco labor had been essential to maintaining irrigation systems and intensive cultivation techniques. The demographic impact of these expulsions, combined with the emigration to American colonies, created labor shortages that affected economic development while altering the peninsula's ethnic composition. The economic transformation that accompanied political unification included the integration of former Islamic territories into Castilian and Aragonese commercial networks while redirecting trade flows toward Atlantic rather than Mediterranean markets. The establishment of direct sea routes to the Americas and around Africa to Asia diminished the importance of trans-Mediterranean trade that had sustained Andalusian prosperity while creating new opportunities for merchants and entrepreneurs who could exploit transatlantic commerce. The influx of precious metals from American mines, particularly silver from Potosi, generated both prosperity and inflation that affected all levels of Spanish society while funding military campaigns throughout Europe that maintained Spanish political hegemony during the 16th century. The cultural legacy of Islamic Iberia survived despite efforts to eliminate visible manifestations of Islamic influence. Mudéjar architecture, a distinctive style that employed Islamic decorative techniques and structural concepts within buildings constructed under Christian patronage proliferated throughout Spain during the 14th through 16th centuries, creating architectural traditions that synthesized Christian and Islamic aesthetic principles. The preservation of Arabic scientific and philosophical texts in Spanish libraries enabled their translation into Latin and subsequent transmission to broader European intellectual communities, contributing to the Renaissance revival of classical learning and the scientific revolution of the early modern period. The agricultural techniques introduced during the Islamic period, including sophisticated irrigation systems, terraced cultivation, and the crops that had revolutionized Andalusian agriculture, continued to shape Iberian agricultural production long after the disappearance of the societies that had developed them. The linguistic impact of 8 centuries of Islamic rule enriched the Spanish language with thousands of Arabic loanwords, particularly in fields including agriculture, architecture, mathematics, and administration, creating a linguistic legacy that persists in modern Spanish. The place names scattered throughout southern and eastern Spain, from Gibraltar, Jebel Tariq, to Guadalquivir, Wadi al-Kabir, to Alcázar and Alhambra, preserve Arabic terminology that commemorates the peninsula's Islamic past. The strategic importance of Iberia's geographic position, controlling access between the Atlantic and Mediterranean while serving as the gateway between Europe and Africa, continued to shape its political and economic development long after the completion of the Reconquista. The establishment of Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires transformed the peninsula from a frontier region contested between Christian and Islamic civilizations into the center of global commercial networks that connected Europe with the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The administrative experience gained through centuries of managing diverse populations with different religious and ethnic identities provided models for colonial governance in American territories while creating legal and institutional frameworks that influenced the development of Latin American societies. But the story of the Iberians, this million-year saga of human occupation, cultural synthesis, and civilizational transformation, had reached its conclusion. The completion of the Reconquista in 1492 marked not just the end of Islamic political authority, but the end of the medieval period that had begun with the Visigothic kingdom's collapse in 711 AD. The Iberian Peninsula was entering a new era. The story of the Iberians encompasses over 1 million years of human history, from the earliest hominids painting bison on cave walls at Altamira to the Catholic monarchs completing the Reconquista and launching global empires. This southwestern corner of Europe served as a stage for some of history's most dramatic transformations. The birthplace of the Belgica culture that spread across Atlantic Europe, the western terminus of Phoenician and Greek colonization, Carthage's base for Hannibal's assault on Rome, one of Rome's wealthiest provinces producing 2 of its greatest emperors, the last refuge of Visigothic Christianity before the Islamic conquest, the location of one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated Islamic civilizations, and finally the launchpad for Spanish and Portuguese exploration that would reshape the entire world. The layers of civilizational development accumulated like geological strata, each conquest adding new elements while transforming existing traditions. The Celtiberians adopted Mediterranean writing systems while maintaining their warrior culture. The Romans absorbed Iberian military tactics while imposing their legal systems. The Visigoths synthesized Roman administrative structures with Germanic warrior traditions. The Islamic conquerors created a unique Andalusian culture that combined Arab, Berber, and Hispano-Roman elements into something new. And the Christian kingdoms that completed the Reconquista inherited all of these traditions, creating a complex cultural synthesis that would be exported globally through colonization. The architectural legacy alone tells the story: prehistoric dolmens, Roman aqueducts, Visigothic churches with horseshoe arches, Islamic palaces with geometric perfection, Gothic cathedrals rising above former mosques, Mudejar buildings synthesizing Christian and Islamic aesthetics. Each style preserved while being transformed by the next wave of builders. The agricultural revolution initiated by Islamic settlers, sophisticated irrigation systems, new crops, intensive cultivation techniques, continued to shape Iberian agriculture centuries after the societies that developed them had disappeared. The scientific knowledge preserved in Andalusian libraries helped spark the European Renaissance. The administrative experience gained through managing diverse populations provided templates for colonial governance across the globe. But perhaps the most significant legacy was cultural, the demonstrated capacity of Iberian societies to absorb, adapt, and synthesize influences from multiple sources while creating something distinctively their own. This wasn't simple conquest and replacement, but complex processes of cultural exchange, intermarriage, religious conversion, and gradual transformation that created hybrid societies combining elements from multiple traditions. The Mozarabs and Mudejare, the Conversos and Moriscos, all represented attempts to navigate between different cultural and religious identities in a world where such boundaries were constantly being redrawn through conquest and forced conversion. The completion of the Reconquista in 1492 ended these processes of cultural synthesis while initiating new ones in the Americas, where Spanish and Portuguese colonizers would encounter indigenous populations and create new hybrid societies through similar processes of conquest, conversion, and cultural exchange. The same year Granada fell, Columbus sailed west seeking a route to Asia, and instead encountered the Americas. The same administrative systems developed to govern conquered Islamic territories would be adapted to govern American colonies. The same religious fervor that had sustained 8 centuries of Reconquista would fuel missionary efforts to convert indigenous populations. The story of the Iberians thus doesn't end in 1492. It transforms and extends globally, influencing the development of societies throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But the medieval Iberian story, the story of this particular peninsula's transformation from prehistoric refuge to Roman province to Islamic civilization to Christian kingdoms, concludes with Boabdil's surrender and the integration of Granada into a unified Spanish monarchy. Subscribe to Flow of History to explore more epic civilizational transformations, from the rise of Byzantium to the 100 Years' War to the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, where cultures clashed, empires rose and fell, and the medieval world gave birth to our modern age through centuries of conquest, exchange, and synthesis that demonstrate humanity's remarkable capacity for both destruction and creation, for both conflict and cultural fusion, for transforming defeat into new beginnings and endings into unprecedented opportunities that reshape entire worlds.